Ever seen a stunning portfolio and thought, I wish mine looked that good? Well, in this video, you'll turn that wish into reality. You'll build this exact portfolio from scratch, crafted to showcase your skills and set you apart in a crowded job market. With seamless interactions and a fully responsive layout, this portfolio is your key to landing your next job or client. While this portfolio looks impressive, the real value is in building it yourself. You'll work with React, Next.js, Tailwind CSS, and Framer Motion. These aren't just buzzwords, they're the tools powering the web's most innovative sites. By the end, you'll have the skills to create fast, visually stunning websites that stand out. But remember, every second you wait is a door closing on a new opportunity. Your portfolio is your digital first impression. It needs to be perfect. Don't settle for good enough when you can create something truly exceptional. As you follow along, I've provided all the design files, starter code, and resources completely free. Be sure to grab those by visiting the link in the description. And if you're just joining us, be sure to check out part 1 in the link below. We've already covered a lot, so start there to get up to speed. Now let's dive in where we left off. Back in our design, we can see that we're now getting to the testimonials section. So we're going to have the same type of eyebrow title and description that we've had before, but of course we're going to have this testimonial, and we're going to keep with that Memoji theme by adding the avatars in our Memojis. Of course, if you've seen the preview to this, you know that we're going to be animating this so that it appears and disappears from the left and right of the screen. And of course, we're also going to make the avatar grow when this card is hovered, as well as the card just turn a little bit for an extra added effect. But we're not going to do any of that right now. Right now, what we're going to focus on is getting to a pixel perfect design, and then we're going to move on to those other things. So over in the tablet view, we can see that we have 2 of those cards now showing. Text has been resized a little bit to be a little bit bigger. And then a desktop view, we can only still see 2 cards, but we have more cards over there to the side. Of course, all this data is already created for us. We just need to put it in place. With that, let's go ahead over to our code. Back in our code, let's go ahead to the page.tsx and import our testimonial section from @section/testimonials. And then we're going to drop it into our main div using this testimonial section component like we do. So let's go ahead and go to our testimonial section, and I'm going to scroll down, and we're going to see that we do have the testimonial section text showing up, which means this is hooked up to our page. I'm going to close out my page, close out my sidebar, and of course, we're just going to focus on this code right now. I'm also going to pull out my design over to the right so that we can see our coded template and our design side by side so that we can go ahead and code this up and see our changes as we go. What we have inside of our testimonial section so far is our list of testimonial data. So we have a name, position, text, and avatar image for all 4 of these testimonials that we have listed here, or actually 5 testimonials that we have listed here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and code this section up. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and remove testimonials section, and we're going to add a semantic paragraph tag for our eyebrow that's going to say happy clients. Below that, we want an H2 for the heading of this section that's going to say what clients say about me. And then below that, we want a paragraph with the description of this section that says, don't just take my word for it, see what my clients have to say about my work. So let's go ahead and put all of that in there and make sure that that's showing up like it should be. And it does look like it is. And then below that, for our content of our testimonials, we'll need a wrapping div for all of those. And inside of that, we'll say testimonials.map. And then for each testimonial itself, we're going to go ahead and show another div. So I'm going to have a div right here. To keep React happy, we'll go ahead and add a key. I think the best key for this is probably just the name of the person. So I'm going to say testimonial.name. And then inside of that, we want to make sure that we have our image. So I'm going to go ahead and display that with next image from next image. The source is going to be the testimonial.avatar. The alt tag is probably just going to be the testimonial.name. And we could save that image and make sure that that is showing up for us, which it is. And then beside that image, of course, we're going to have their position and their name. So I'm going to have a div for testimonial.name. And next to that, we're going to have their title, or below that, I should say, or their position. And then of course the text of the testimonial itself. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in a paragraph, and that is going to be testimonial.text. Once all that is showing up, it's time to get into our styling for this section. Now, one of the things I'm noticing in relation to our styles is that we continue to have these eyebrows, these titles, and these descriptions at the top of our sections. What if instead of creating these every single time, we could just go ahead and create a reusable component so that we wouldn't have to create this over and over again? So I'm going to actually try to go ahead and create that reusable component that we can bring into this section and then we can use for the rest of our build. So I'm going to come over into my components, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new component called section header.tsx. And I'm going to export my const section header. And of course, it's going to take in some props, and I'm just going to return some JSX. Now I have inside of my testimonials, I have just the basic HTML without any styles. It'd be great to go ahead and grab this from another one of my completed sections so that we could just grab and use what we already have. Now, the first place I've used that so far is in my featured projects. Let's see if we can go grab that from my projects.tsx and then use that HTML that we already have. So I'm going to grab this right here. I'm going to copy this over into my section header, and it's going to return the text that we see right here. We're going to have to put this inside a React fragment because we have to have one wrapping kind of div or fragment in order to hold all of our content. We can't have the parent level of the component being multiple divs or multiple elements. Now that we have that section header inside a component, it's time to think about how are we actually going to use this. So let me make sure that first of all, there's nothing that would be strange with the way that we're sizing this. But of course, what we're really going to want to do is bring in some eyebrow text here, bring in a title here, and then bring in a description here, and that should allow us to use this. So I'm going to go ahead and create those props. I'm going to say that my title is going to be one of my props, my eyebrow is going to be another one of the props, and then my description is going to be the third prop. And of course, because we're using TypeScript, we need to tell TypeScript what all three types of these props are. So the title is of course going to be a string, the eyebrow is also going to be a string, and the description is going to be a string. Now these are gray because we haven't used them yet, but of course we're going to drop them into the right spots. So right here where real world results is, we're going to drop our eyebrow, we're going to drop our title right here, and we're going to drop our description to replace this text right here. So description should be that text right there. After I save that, I haven't actually put this component anywhere. And of course, right now, all of these are required. We'll leave this until we don't need all these to be required. We need to change this around. But for right now, this will work just fine. So I'm going to come back into my testimonials and see if we can drop this section header component into there. So I'm going to say section header. I'm just going to start using it, and my IDE will bring it up and say that we can import it. So I'm going to hit enter on that. That will go ahead and import it at the top of the file. You can see that it's done that correctly right there. And then we can just give it the props we need. So the eyebrow is going to be equal to our happy clients. Just going to copy and paste that. The title is going to be equal to what we just saw here. Just going to cut and paste that as well. And then of course our description is going to be equal to this line right here. So I'm going to just cut and paste into our description. I'm going to remove all of my other elements, save this, of course, adding an ending tag there. And then I'm going to scroll down and see if our description is styled up as we would want. And indeed it is. We don't have a container or extra padding yet, but it looks like it's the right size. All of the titles and description text is the right size, and that the gradient is being held inside of our happy client's eyebrow container as well, so that it is showing what we would want. Let's try and use the same section header inside of our project section and just ensure that that shows up properly there. So I'm going to come into my project section where we grabbed this from. I'm going to say section header and just go ahead and import that as well. And then of course we need three props. We're going to say eyebrow, copy and paste this. The title, of course, I'm going to copy and paste that. And then for the description, I'm going to cut and paste that. And hopefully if everything works out well, which of course it should, this is where we grabbed the original code from, we can save this section header, and now we have our styles essentially for free every time we use them. So let me just go ahead and double check versus my design to see if there's anything that looks off. Not seeing anything off, so that means I think we're good with that. Let's come back down into our section and continue what we're doing. So I'm gonna close out my projects and I'm gonna come back into my testimonials. Now, of course, we said that we needed a container around this section, so let's go ahead and drop that in. Div class name equals container to get the content from the edges of the screen. And after we save that, we also need to go ahead and add a little bit of padding to the top and bottom of this. I'm going to say class name equals py16. That should add the padding that we need to the top and bottom and should be aligned to the design. So I'm going to double check one more time by overlaying our design that our section header is working as we expect. And when I come back in here, it looks like it is pixel perfect. So I'm going to push my design back out to the side and continue my work on our testimonial cards. Now for the cards themselves, we can see that they're a little bit lighter and they have that light gray background as well. Now for the cards themselves, we can see that they're a little bit lighter than the screen and they have that little bit of green background that we've used before. So we can go ahead and code that up by adding a class name to our wrapping div for each card and saying the BG is going to be gray 800, which will provide the lighter color. We also want them to have some border radius. So we'll say rounded 3XL to give them border radius. We want to ensure that there is some padding. So we'll say P6 to give them 24 pixels of padding on all sides. And then we of course need that green background underneath this card. So let me go ahead and come to the top and I'm going to say import green image from @/assets/images/grain, and then we can use that inside of our card. Now we know from before that we're going to need to make this absolutely positioned so that we can add the style of the background itself. So I'm going to make the card itself relative, and then inside of that, I'm going to come here and I'm going to say div class name equals absolute, and we're going to say inset 0 to make it the same size as the card itself. Then we can add a style attribute, and in that style attribute, we can say background image and go ahead and add a URL of our grain image.source, and that should add the grain image over our entire card, which of course it does. Let's come back to our card and say overflow hidden to ensure that we're not having the edges of it overflowed by our absolutely positioned elements. Of course, we know that this is going to be opacity 5. So let's say opacity 5 to make it that 5% opacity that we're seeing. And then it looks like we're still overlaying our content. It's actually hard to see. If we change this to opacity 50, it's a lot easier to see what's actually going on. We're actually overlaying our content, and that's certainly something we don't want to do. So we're going to reset our z-index by saying z0 here, and then we can have a negative z-index here. So I'm going to say negative z10, and that should just pull it down below our content. And then when we come back down to opacity 5, it pulls that underneath of our content. Now, the more we build this card, the more I'm realizing that this might be another perfect opportunity for us to create a reusable card component where we can adjust some things about it, but a lot of the things might stay the same. We're going to have our grain that's going to come below the card that's going to stay the same. We're going to have our outline on the outside of the card that's going to stay the same. Now the padding will change and the sizing of the card, of course, will be dictated by the section that uses it, but everything else seems like the background color is going to stay the same. So let's see if we can create a reusable component out of our card as well. So I'm going to come up into my components and I'm just going to create a new file called card.tsx, and we're going to see if we can create something reusable from this. So I'm going to say const, I should say export const card, and we're going to take in some props, of course, and then we're going to return some JSX here. So let's take what we have so far. Actually, because we already have some cards up here that we've defined, let's go ahead and just use those cards as the starting point, and then that will allow us to have a good starting point for our cards down in our testimonials section. So once again, I'm going to come into my projects.tsx and I'm going to find where I created my cards at. And it looks like that would be right here where I defined each portfolio project is where I created my cards. It's got the background, it's got the absolute, it's got the grain image, all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste this div right into here. And there's going to be a couple of things, of course, that we're not going to want to use right here. So the key is not something that we're going to want to use. We also need an ending div. So I'm going to add that ending div to the bottom here. And then of course, we don't have our grain image imported here yet. So I'm going to come to the top of the file and import my grain image from @/assets/images/grain.jpg. and that should allow that to come into this section. Now the card is not just going to have some of these different, let me go ahead and toggle my word wrap on this so you can see. The card is not just going to have all of these classes. Some of these are actually specific to the way that we used it inside of our project. So for example, the padding is specific to the way we used it inside of our projects. So we can add padding to our card, but what we want to do is we want to make sure we can override it, or that the user of the component can override our card class names. So in order to do that, let's double check on the things we want to stay the same. So the background, we definitely want to stay the same. We want to go ahead and leave that border radius on here. Relative, we need to be on here because we're adding an absolute element. Z0, we're going to leave on here. Overflow hidden for sure. And then this after element is basically setting our outline. So we definitely want that to be on there as well. So that keeps that on there. We'll keep this on here. We'll keep after absolute, inset 0, outline 2, outline. The negative outline offset, the rounded 3XL will also be on there. The white for the border will also be on there. And then we're getting to the actual padding for this card. And of course, our after pointer events none, we're going to want to leave on there. So I'm going to move this up to here. And then our padding is what we're going to just want to basically be able to override. So in order to do this, we're going to use Tailwind merge to say, okay, if there's a class name that gets added to this card, we're just going to merge it with what we already have here. And we're going to let the user of the component go ahead and override what we've already set. So we're going to pull out class name here as a prop. We're going to allow someone to use that. And if they do, we're just going to say TW merge. And it's going to merge our current with whatever they pass in. So I'm going to say class name here. And as you can see, it's basically this string plus the prop of class name that comes in. To make TypeScript happy, let's say class name is a string, but it doesn't have to be there. So I'm going to go ahead and give that question mark and says basically it could be there, it could not be there, but if it is there, it's going to be a string and it's going to get added right here. So I'm going to replace all of these padding classes with the padding that we're actually going to use in our testimonials of P6. So essentially we're going to override our padding on our card in here in our project section, but our default is just going to be our P6 to give it that little bit of padding right out of the box. I'm going to save that. I think that's pretty much all we need, except for our card needs to be able to take children. So the content of the card, we want this to be able to be used, but then whoever's using it to be able to drop in custom content. And of course, that's going to come with children. So children is that special way React says that we can drop in the children of a component or the content of our JSX element that comes in through a children prop. And essentially, in order to type this, all I need to do is say props with children, and that's going to be a type coming directly from React. So we have props with children, and then our class name is coming in as well. So that will allow us to use the children prop, and then we just need to drop it where the children need to be added. And that's going to be below our absolutely positioned element. So I'm just going to say children right here, if I can spell right, and that's going to allow the children of this component to be used. Okay, so let's see if we can integrate this card component in our testimonials, and then we're going to come back and see if we can integrate this card component into our projects. So coming into testimonials again, let's go ahead and try and add a card here. So this is going to replace what we've got going on here. So let me go ahead and import my card at the top of my file. I'm going to import card from @/component/card, and then I'm going to use my card right here, card, and I'm going to leave my key as testimonial.name, and then I'm going to have an ending card surrounding all of my card content. Of course, because this is already inside of our card, we don't need to import this again. This is just going to already be added in our card components. Let me save this. Let me scroll down to my testimonials and see if we have a working card. And it looks like we do. Although I'm not seeing any sort of padding on here, which is interesting to me, but that's fine. Let me come back into my card component, and it looks like because we have this extra little semicolon here, that padding wasn't going to work. So let me update that, and we can see that we now have padding by default on our card component. Now that worked out really well. Let's come back into our projects and see how we can integrate this now reusable card component into each of our projects. So in order to do that, we're going to place this with the card. And the reason we're going to do it that way is because we want to make sure that we can leave some of the padding class names that we've already added. So let me go ahead and just toggle this word wrap for this file again so that we can see what these class names are here. And then we're also going to come to the ending of the card. We can see this nice white line that this IDE gives us, and we can say ending card, and that's going to end that. Now, we haven't imported this card. Let me just go ahead and try and see if we can re-import that. There we go. And then we just need to make sure that we take out all of the styles that would be applied by the card by default. So let's go ahead and take out all of these after styles, all of the background styles, but we do want to leave our custom padding. We also can take away this after pointer events none. We know that's being added in our card, but the custom padding will stay. In fact, the custom padding may mess up from our card versus our projects because we're not actually setting any bottom padding, but our card is going to, by default, set bottom padding. So we may have to remove that bottom padding. We'll check that out here in a second. Okay, so this background image, we also don't need that anymore because we already have that defined in our card component. So let me save that. Let's scroll back up to our cards and let's see what the difference is. And you can see, yes, there is some difference in spacing, especially on our mobile component, because we are now introducing bottom padding. So we need to say PB0 to make sure on the mobile side that that padding gets taken off, and that looks like it's now pixel perfect to our design. Let me scroll over to make sure we haven't messed anything else up on any of our other views either. I'm not seeing anything wrong with this one here. And then over on our desktop view, let's make sure we haven't messed that up as well. And now we have that looking perfect. So yeah, that works perfectly. Our card component is now working well. So let me go ahead and X out my projects. We've now integrated that with that reusable card component. I'm going to X out my card because we don't need to even worry about that anymore. And then we can just focus on our testimonials and styling those up. Now for our testimonials header, we want to align our image or our avatar next to our name and position. So I'm going to wrap all three of those in a div. And that div is going to be a class name of flex so that we can flex those side by side. Of course, we want the testimonial name and position to be together. So we'll wrap those two in a div as well. And that should put those top to bottom. And then we just need to worry about our different styles. So our image probably needs to be wrapped in a div so that we can have our background color and then set the size of it. So I'm going to say div class name here as well. And then for that image, we want to make sure that it is set to size of 14 or 56 pixels and that it has a background of gray 700. Of course, we'll want this to also be inline flex, rounded, full to make sure that it has the border radius that it needs. And for some reason that inline flex looks like it stretched our image a little bit. So let's go ahead and say items, center, justify, center. And it looks like it pushed it back down. I'm a little worried about our size 14 with our image inside because it looks like our image may be a little stretched. Let's double check on this. I'm going to say class name equals a size, and then we're going to come down and just do 96 just to have some sort of size there. And this is interesting. Essentially what we're seeing on this image is we're seeing the max width take effect, but the max height, there is no max height set. So instead of this size, let's just say max height full and see if that will push our image back into the position that it needs to be. And it looks like it does. So with that, we'll go ahead and continue styling up the rest of this. And if it isn't perfect, we're definitely going to find out about it when we overlay our design to our testimonials section content. Inside of our other div, we of course want to make sure that we flex this with a gap. So I'm going to say gap 4. And of course we want this to be items center as well to ensure that our content is aligned to our avatar. Inside of our testimonial name, we want class name equals font semi-bold to pull up the weight of that. And then for our position, we want class name equal to text small to make that a little smaller. And of course it needs to be a little lighter as well. So this will be text white 40, and that will make that 40% opacity that we see. For our text, we also want to make sure that that's split from the rest of the testimonial. So I'm going to say MT4 on that to make sure that that has a little bit of top margin. I'm going to say text small to make sure that the text is the right size as well. And then that looks like that's about it for each of these cards. But of course we have this gap right here that we need to take care of. And that's going to be on the div that's around our cards. So let's go ahead and update this div and say MT or class name equals MT12. and that should push our card testimonial down below our content. Now, right now, from what I can see, it doesn't look like each of our testimonials are quite far enough down. Let's see if we can just make that MT16 and get them to line up perfectly side by side here. That looks like it's much closer to what we wanted. We also know that our testimonials need to be aligned side to side, and that of course means we need kind of a max width or width that this testimonial can grow to. So I'm going to add that onto our testimonial card. That's going to be in the form of a class name, and that's going to be max width extra small to make sure that it can't grow beyond those 20 rems. After I kind of align my other cards, the only other thing we need to do is we need to make sure that these testimonials are flexed side to side. Now that would normally be this right here, but we need one wrapping div to flex them, and then we need another wrapping div to say flex none. So I'm going to add my flex onto here, but then within it I need another wrapping div, and that's going to say flex none, and that's going to essentially allow the cards to continue to grow outside of my flexed container so that I can make sure that they can continue to expand without being constrained by my other containers that are around them, because we essentially want them to be able to continue to grow over to the right. Now this flex container is also going to set the gap between each of our testimonials, and it looks like right now that gap is set to 32 pixels. So I'm going to update that, and then we can see that yes, we indeed have a gap in between our different testimonials. Now this outer container is going to be the one that's going to constrain our elements, and this is also going to be the one where we're going to add our fade left and right to our different elements. So I'm going to say overflow x clip, and that will ensure that we don't have any content overflowing that outer container. So I can't scroll left and right anymore. And if I hit refresh, you can see that there's that little overflow warning down here. If I hit refresh, that overflow warning shouldn't be there anymore because we don't have anywhere to overflow, because we just took away the possibility of that with that overflow X clip. And then of course, that's also, we're going to add my mask image. That's going to add my little bit of gradient fade here as well. So that's going to be a linear gradient. It's going to be to right. It's going to start at transparent, go to black at 10%, go to black at 90%, and go once again to transparent. And once I save that, we should see that fade. So essentially what this mask image does, if you're not familiar with these mask images, essentially they're going to mask whatever is inside of this div, and basically say anytime this is transparent, it's not going to show whatever's in the div. And then when it gets up to a solid color, it is going to show what's in the div. So between 0 and 10%, it's going to fade up into showing what's in this div. And then between 90 and 100%, it's going to fade back out and not show what's in this div. We can't see that very well because of our little gap between our different testimonials, but when we animate these, we'll be able to see that a lot better. Right now, it looks like this section is about as pixel perfect as it gets. So let me go ahead and use my overlaid image to see if we actually do have truly a pixel perfect section. And if I scroll over here, we can see, let's see if we have something a little bit different. And it looks like what's different is this header where our avatar is actually a little bit bigger, and the size of it is also a little bit bigger as well. So it looks like what's actually happening, let's talk about this for a second. It looks like our avatar is being squished. It is being flexed up there. And so sometimes we need to say, hey, we don't want to flex shrink this particular thing at all. And that's the case with this. We don't want this to shrink no matter how much space our other text is taking up. So all I'm going to do is say flex shrink 0, and that should make sure that my avatar does not shrink even though my text might take up more space. And that gives us that perfect pixel perfection that we're after. Now that our mobile view is done, it's time to move over to our tablet view and see if that looks good as well. Over in the tablet view, a lot seems to have changed. Now, not about the title, which of course we have that header section component that's taking care of all that, but the cards themselves seem to have grown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase our design image opacity so we can really see the difference. So this is the design right here when it's folded all the way to the left. And then this is what we currently have when it's all the way to the right. So the size of these are changing. Looks like the text size is also changing. And then we have some minor differences in padding of our card as well at this size. So let's go ahead and see if we can take care of those things by coming back into our code and adjusting these for this tablet size. The first thing I'm going to do is come to our card and add the extra padding at this size. So I'm going to say medium P8, and that should allow those to be a little bit bigger there. And we're also going to change the max width of these. So at the medium size, we're going to say max width medium, and that is going to make sure that they have the right max width. The testimonial text size also changes. So we're going to say medium text base. That should make the size increase there. And let's see if that takes care of our issues. Let's come back and use this slider again to see if there's any difference. And it looks like there's a little bit of difference in the amount of margin between our text and our header as well. So let's come in and change this MT4 at the medium size to MT6. And that should update that. And let's go ahead and do one more check to see if that took care of our issues. Let's slide this back and forth again. And now we are pixel perfect. There's literally no difference between our design and our code, which is exactly where we want to be. Coming over to the desktop size, let's go ahead and check this one as well. I'm going to pull out this slider a little bit, and I'm also going to go ahead and close out my sidebar to give my code a little more room to breathe as we pull out this view so we can see it. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick slide left and right to see what the differences are. One of the differences, let me go ahead and increase the opacity of my design as well, so we can see this. One of the differences is definitely the amount of space in between the top of this component and the bottom. So that is going to be up here. We're going to say at the large size, this is going to be PY24, and that should hopefully change that to be exactly equal, which of course it looks like it is. We're also changing this space between our testimonials and the header as well. So at the large size, this MT16 is probably going to go up to, at the large size, MT20, so that the spacing adjusts. Let's go ahead and just wiggle that around a little bit. It's not quite there. Let's try MT24. And that looks like it is perfect to what we wanted. So as we go back and forth, now we're seeing there's no difference between our design and our code, which is exactly where we want to be. With that, this testimonial section is wrapped up, at least before we add our animations. We're going to come back and do that later, but thank you for sticking with me through that. And we're going to dive in to the next section. Back in our design, let's look at the About Me section. So this section has 4 different parts. So you have this title, of course, this header up here in this section, and then you have these cards that contain my reads, my toolbox, beyond the code, and a little map. So it's a little bit different than some of our other card usages so far, but that's fine. We can figure all of that out. When you get over to the tablet view and you come down here, you can see it has a little bit of a bento box type look where you have this smaller column content and they have this larger column content. So we'll figure out how to do that with CSS Grid. And then on the desktop size, then you're getting the full effect of the bento box where you have this 1/3, 2/3 kind of deal going on. We'll do all of that. So this definitely has a little bit of complexity to it, but it won't be too bad. We're going to figure all this out in our code. Over in our code, the first thing we're going to need to do is hook up our About section into our page. Let's come into our page.tsx and import our About section from section/about, and then drop this into the bottom of our page by importing the About section component into the bottom of our div. After that's done, we can come into our sections/about, and let's double check by scrolling down that we are seeing that About section text at the bottom of the page. It looks like we are, which means we can start to code this section content up. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to slide this out again, and I'm going to go ahead and put my reference image onto the side so that we can see what this is supposed to look like. And then I'm going to start creating my section content. So the first part of this is going to be replacing this About section text with our header. We already have a header component, so we're going to go ahead and use that same thing by bringing in the section header. And we're going to go ahead and add the props of eyebrow. So the eyebrow is going to be About Me. The title is going to be a glimpse into my world. And then the text of this, or the description, is going to be learn more about who I am, what I do, and what inspires me. And with that section header, we should see that showing up in our page, which of course we do down here. Below that, we are going to have our 4 bento cards. So I'm going to go ahead and import our card component as well. So I'm going to import card from @component/card. That will allow us to use our 4 cards. What I'm also going to do so that it makes it easier for us to see what our content is actually showing is I'm going to add a lot of bottom padding onto this section just so it allows us to kind of scroll down and see more of a reference image. So let me say class name equals and then PB, and just add pretty much as much bottom padding as we can get so that we can see a lot more of our design over to the right. Okay, so I'm seeing a little bit more of that. So that will allow me to kind of start to fill some of this stuff in. Inside of our cards, we know that these are going to be constrained inside of a div. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in on my div. And then my first card is going to have my content inside of it. Most of these card headers are going to be the same. We're probably going to come back and go ahead and create some sort of card header component in order to be able to add those in there as well. But for now, I'm just going to add them in as they are. So we know we have our star icon. So I need to import that as well. I'm going to import my star icon from @assets/icons/star.svg, and that will allow me to use that as a component right here. So I'm going to wrap a div around here and add my star icon inside of that div. Next to my star icon, I'm going to have my title. So this is going to be just in maybe an H3 tag, semantic H3. I'm going to say my reads. That's going to be for the title. And then for the description, I'm going to add a paragraph, a semantic paragraph tag. I'm going to say explore the books shaping my perspectives. And that should allow me to see that as well. Underneath this title, we're also going to have an image that we're going to be bringing in. And so we're going to have to import that image as well. So I'm going to import my book image from @assets/images/book cover. And then I'm going to just go ahead and bring in next/image to be able to display that image. So I'm going to say image. My source is going to be my book image. The alt tag is going to be book cover, and that should allow my image to show up in my card. I'm not going to style anything up in here yet. We're going to continue on to the next card that we're going to create right here. This next card, I'm just going to copy and paste this right here into our next card. And we're going to change a couple of things about this one. Of course, the title is going to be my toolbox. The description is going to be a little bit different. So this is going to say, explore the technologies and tools used to craft exceptional digital experiences. That's going to be the description for that one. And then we're not going to have the book image, of course, below this. We're actually going to have a couple of divs with some icons and some text. So we'll go ahead and have those. So I'm going to put these below that div. I'm going to create another div, and I'm just going to create the first line of these for now so that we're not spending too much time on this different content. So what I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to come to the top of my file, and I'm going to create the array of the different items that we're going to be adding in here. So let's just call this const toolbox items. And this is going to be an array with some different objects in it. We're going to have a title and an icon for each of these. So the title for this one is going to be Java, a string of JavaScript. And then we're going to have an icon here, and we're just going to leave that blank for now as an empty string. And we're going to have a few more of these. So I'm going to just copy and paste this probably 6 or 7 times just to have enough items here. The next one is going to be HTML5. Third one, CSS3. Fourth one is React. 5th is Chrome, 6th is GitHub, and 7th, then we don't actually have. So it looks like we just have 6 items here. This is going to be our toolbox items array. And then we need to import all of the separate icons for these different toolbox items. So I'm going to try and import those as well. The first one's going to be the JavaScript icon. So I'm going to import my JavaScript icon from @assets/icons/squarejs.svg. I'm going to import my HTML icon from @assets/icons/html5. I'm going to import my CSS. I have to make sure that they have capital letters so that we can use them as components from @assets/icons/css3.svg. Importing my React icon from @assets/icons/react.svg. I'm I'm going to import my Chrome icon from @/assets/icons/chrome.svg. And then last but not least, I'm going to import my GitHub icon from @/assets/icons/github.svg. With those imported, we should just be able to drop them directly into this icon field here. And I think what I'm going to do is just go ahead and create the actual JSX. So here I'm going to say JavaScript icon and then just go ahead and leave it directly like that. For the next icon, I'm going to have an HTML icon. I'm going to go ahead once again and create that. This one is going to be the CSS icon. The next one is going to be the React icon, which of course we want to be in JSX. This one is going to be the Chrome icon. And the last one is going to be the GitHub icon, JSX. So all those toolbox items are there. All of the titles are there. So let's see if we can go ahead and show these inside of at least the first div. Now we know that we want these to all be inside of separate divs. So I'm going to say toolbox items.map, and then I'm going to get an item. And for each item, we're going to want to show a div. And that div is also going to have a key of item.title. We're going to want to show the icon itself. So we'll say item.icon. And then beside the icon, which we can just wrap in a span tag just so we can position it, we're also going to want to wrap the title in a span tag as well. So item.title. And that should allow those to show up. Now, the icons right now are huge. Probably want to just go ahead and bring those down a little bit. So in order to do that, we'll go ahead and make sure that each of these icons has the same size. Now, one of the things I'm kind of seeing on this is that we're going to be repeating all of the classes in this JSX every single time by adding a class name here, but we'll have to add that same class name onto all of our icons. What if we could create a repeatable component to be able to use these different icons and to be able to display these and only create that class name once? And in fact, that's what we're going to do by creating another component. We're going to call this let's just call it a language icon or a tech icon.tsx. And we're going to export a const tech icon, and that's going to take in some props. And of course, it's already going to return some JSX. Now for these, what we want to do is basically be able to say that we want each of these different toolbox items to tell us what type of icon it is. Essentially, we want it to tell us what component we're actually going to be rendering for that icon. This is a little bit different. So we can't have our JSX wrapper around this. We just want a component type here. So I'm going to actually take off these different opening and closing carets because we want a component type instead of the actual icon itself. So let's also go ahead and change our icon. Instead of saying icon, we're just going to say icon type. And let me go ahead and select all of those by getting that string and then just saying icon type. Now that will allow us to come down here. Now we no longer have an icon. This is going to be undefined, and that's fine. What we're going to do is we're going to use our tech icon. So let's just bring in tech icon, and we're going to pass it a prop of as, or component, we could even say, equals item.icon type. So we are not accepting this prop yet. We can do that back in our component code, but essentially we're going to tell it what component to render using this component prop. It's a very interesting technique, but one we can definitely do. So we know we're going to need to take in a component prop, and that component prop is going to be a React.element type. That's essentially saying I want to be able to pass the type of the element as a prop. Now, in order to be able to actually use that as an element type, we need to capitalize it. So all we need to do is kind of save it in the capitalized version by saying const component is equal to component. So essentially it's just saying basically capitalize this and save it to a new variable. And then we can just use it as the element that we output in our JSX. So we're just basically saying, okay, you passed us this component, this element type. We're going to use this to just render whatever component that you gave us in this component prop. So when I save this tech icon and I come back here and actually use that component, we can see that we now have our icons showing up in our page. Now that works really well because now we have the ability to adjust our class names and all of our different things that we need to do for this tech icon right here within one place rather than adjusting it 6 times. So I'm going to say class name equals in here, and it's going to say size 10, and hopefully that will knock it down to the 40 by 40 that we want for our different tech icons, which it definitely does. And that's just going to be a lot more helpful for us to come back and style that in the future. Okay, so this is my toolbox. I'm going to stop here because I just wanted to bring those down so that we didn't have any more problems with the way that our page was rendering for now. So I'm going to come back into my about.tsx and move on to my next card. The next card is going to say beyond the code. So I'm going to say card. And then of course, I'm going to just basically copy and paste this right here and move it into my other card. Anytime I'm copying and pasting something is actually a hint that I might want to create a reusable component from that. And like I said, we're probably going to come back and create a card header to create a reusable component around that. So my H3 in this case is going to say beyond the code. And in this case, the text for this is going to say explore my interests and hobbies beyond the digital realm. And that's going to be what that does. And then we're also going to have a 4th card. Now this card looks a little bit different than our other cards because this card, actually, you're not seeing any padding. It has a different background image on it, but it is still a card. It still has that outlined border that is true of all of our other cards. So I am going to go ahead and still create this card component. It's not going to have a card header. It's just going to show the map image. And of course, on top of that, we're going to have emoji and all of that. So in order to do that, all I'm going to do is come up and import my map image. So import map image from @/assets/images/map.png. And then I'm going to just use my map image inside this card. I can go ahead. I think I'm just going to use my next/image with a source of map image and an alt tag of map inside of that card, because that will allow me to go ahead and just make this an absolute positioned element, and I can just throw it over the background of the entire card. And then inside here, I'm also going to add my memoji, so I need to bring that in as well. So let's import my smile memoji from @/assets/images/memoji smile. And I'm going to also import this here as well. So I'm going to say image source equals my smile emoji, and my alt equals smiling emoji. And that should at least put the content inside that card. There is one other part I realized as I'm looking through what we have in the design versus what we have in the code. When I did this beyond the code, I didn't put all of these little tags or labels or whatever you want to call them inside this beyond the code card. So we'll need to go ahead and add that part as well. So I'm going to come up here to the top, and I'm going to go ahead and make another constant here. And I'm just going to call this const hobbies, and it's going to be another array with some objects. So I'm going to have a title for each one, and I'm also going to have an emoji for each one. And of course, it's just going to be text with the actual emoji. So what I'm seeing right here is we have painting, and the emoji for that is going to be, let's see if we can find it, paint. For the next one, we have title of photography, and the emoji is going to be this camera. We're going to use that one. And then I'm going to copy and paste these. It looks like we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different ones. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I'll just remove my last one, make it 7. And then we can just fill in with what we have. So we have gaming on one of them. We have a little controller. There we go. Hiking is the next one. And we have a boot. Music is our 5th one. And we have musical notes. We also have fitness. We have weightlifting. And we have reading and our pile of books. Okay, so we have all of the data that we need for our hobbies. So let's go to our Beyond the Code card. And below our div, we're just going to create another div that's going to wrap all these hobbies. And then we're going to map through our hobby list dot map. And then we'll just say hobby right here. And for each hobby, of course, we're going to have some JSX delivered. So we're just going to put a div there. The key is going to be hobby, HOBBY dot title. And then we're going to have a span tag with the title. So this is be hobby.title. And then the next span tag will be the emoji itself. That's not a paragraph, that's a span. And that will have the hobby.emoji inside of there. So that should give us all of those emojis. They're not styled up, of course, but we can do that when we get to that particular card. Now that we have the content created for this section, it's time to start styling up these different cards to make it look like we see over here in the right in the actual design. So the first thing we're going to worry about is on our About section. We have a large padding bottom. Let's go ahead and change the padding to the correct value. That should be PY16 to give us 4 rems on the top and bottom for that padding. So I think that should make it about even with what I see on my design. I also want to make sure that we have our container listed here. So outside of our section header, we're going to have a div class name equals container, and that's going to surround all of the content for this div. So let's go put the ending div down here, and that should ensure that we have a container around all of our content. I'm seeing a little bit of a difference in how much spacing I have on the top of this particular section versus the bottom of the last one. And I want to ensure that everything is aligned. So let me actually go ahead and overlay my design and see how much difference we have. Yeah, we definitely do have a little bit of difference. Let me try and knock this up to maybe a PY20 and see if that will allow us to have the correct spacing. It doesn't seem like that is quite right either. It's almost like it's an 18 value, or that there's some additional padding or margin somewhere in this particular section. So let's see if we can get that straightened out before we move on. So if I come into my design and go ahead and overlay my design on top of my text, I can see that if I update this to PY20 and then do a little bit of a scroll, that is exactly matching the design. So for some reason, this section has a little bit more padding than the last one, unless for some reason we messed up on our testimonials and it had a little bit more padding than we gave it there. So one way or the other, there is that extra 16 pixels of spacing. So I want to make sure, because we're trying to make this pixel perfect to our design, that all of that is included. So we just went ahead and updated our About section to say PY20, and hopefully that will make it consistent with our design. So let me go ahead and pull my design over to the side again, and then we can update all of our card. Then we can update our card container so that we can make sure that that is aligned as well. With our card container, we're going to say class name equals MT20, and that should make it equal to what we see over there on the left. And then this is where I'd really like to go ahead and style up my card header. So let me come into my card header and let's see what we need to do. We probably need to wrap our star icon and title in a div so that we can say class name equals inline flex. So we can flex those beside each other. The icon itself, we're going to want to have a class name so we can adjust the size. So class name equals size 9 should give it that 36 pixels of size that it has. We also want the text to be emerald 300 so that it's the right color. Of course, we talked about the way that that SVG will take in the color of that text. And then for the title, we know that we want the class name here to be font sans, or sorry, font serif, because we want that to be the serif text. This inline flex, we're going to say items center so that it aligns to the center. And then we're going to adjust the title font size as well. So we text 3XL should increase that font size, and we want some gap in between our star and our text, and that's going to be gap 2, and that should enable that gap to be there like it is in the design. For our description, we want this to be a little bit lighter and smaller. So class name equals text small, and text white 60 should take care of making that lighter and smaller as well. So let's see if that matches our design by going ahead once again and overlaying that. And it does look like we're almost perfect, but we do have a little bit of an adjustment to make to our text and where it's sitting in relation to our title. So right now we don't have a great way of controlling that because we haven't flexed our title versus our description yet. So we're going to come back up here to the wrapper and say class name equals flex, and flex call to flex it in the column direction. And then we'll scroll that a little bit more. We want to add either a little bit of gap here or margin top here. If you've watched any of my videos, you know I'm probably a bigger fan of margin top than doing that particular thing with gap. So we'll do the margin top there. And now you can see it is pixel perfect in our header. Let me move my design back out to the side, and let's go ahead and take another look at this to see if there's anything else that we should change about this particular part of our code. So obviously we need to bring our book size down. We need to have some negative margin to pull it back down out of the bottom. And we also need to adjust for the size in between our books. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and wrap this in a separate div just to control the size of it. And then for that div, we'll say class name equals width 40 to give that 80 pixels of width. MX Auto should push it towards the center, and then we'll also say MT8 to push it down from the title. Now for our negative margin, we know that we're going to have that. Now in order to get our book down from the top, what we actually have is we want all of these boxes or cards to be the same height. So essentially the height is going to constrain our image more than anything else, because all of these cards are going to be the exact same height. And then of course the overflow is just going to flow outside of the card itself. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and add a separate class name to our card. And that class name is going to set the height to a custom value of 320 pixels. And let's see if that shows up correctly side by side. It looks like it does. It looks like it shows up exactly as we want it to. And as we scroll down, we can see that we haven't added it to our other cards yet, but of course we will whenever we make our update here. Now that we know what our title is going to do, now that we've styled up our title, I don't want to continue to style our title multiple times. So let's go ahead and make that a reusable component as well. So I'm going to come up into my components folder. I'm going to add a new file called cardheader.tsx. And in that card header, I'm going to export my const card header. And we're going to, of course, take in some props and return some JSX. I don't think I copied that JSX. I'm going to come back into my about section, and I'm just going to take all of this JSX, copy it, and paste it into my card header like so. The star icon needs to be imported into this file, so we can go ahead and do that at the top by importing our star icon from @assets/icon/star.svg, and that should allow our card header to show up consistently. Now we just need to allow for some props to come into our card header. The things that are going to change are going to be the title and the description. So let's say title and description are going to be the props that we take in. We're going to type those as title string and description string, and then that will allow us to use them. And then we're just going to replace whatever is in title with the inside of the H3, and then we're going to replace whatever the content of this paragraph is with the description that comes in the prop. So with that title and description, that should allow us to just basically have this same JSX rendering every time, gives us our star icon for free, gives us all these styles for free, and then we can just change the title and the description. So coming back outside of that, let's come back into our about section, and let's replace all of this with card header. If I just hit enter, it should import it, and then I just need to set my title and my description. Now what I'm realizing is I would rather copy and paste those. So let me undo that for a second. Let me bring this in right here, card header, and then I'm just going to copy and paste my title and description. So I'm going to grab what I have here, and I'm going to grab what I have here, paste those in there, and then I can remove all of this extra code, because now our card header should be taking care of that. Now right here it says it can't find the name, which means it wasn't imported. So let me come up to the top and say import card header from @/component/card header. Save that again, and that should allow that to be imported. So as I come back down, let's go ahead and check and make sure that our card header was properly imported all the way back down here, and it looks like it was indeed imported correctly. Now that we're done with this card, we can move on to our next one. So I'm going to go down to my toolbox, and of course I want to use the same card header component we just created. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste this right here, and then I'm going to change the title with the title that we have here. So I'm going to change this to my toolbox. Of course, I'm going to do the same thing with the description. Go ahead and copy and paste this directly into the description and ensure that we have this all on one line. And then I'm just going to remove what we have as our former card header, and we get our styled card header essentially for free. While we're at it, I'll go ahead and change the third one out as well. So I'm going to copy and paste this card header right here, and then it's going to change the title and the description for this one as well. So go ahead and cut and paste the description on here as well, and then remove the extra code that we no longer need. Save that, and that should give us our card header for that third card as well. Of course, with our fourth card, we don't have a card header, so I'm not going to worry about that one yet. And then we're going to go up to our second card and see what else we need to do to style this card. Now that we've taken care of all of our card titles, it's time for us to come into our My Toolbox card and go ahead and style up each of these toolbox items here. So the first thing I'm going to do is make them flexed with class name equals inline flex. That should put the text next to each of our icons, and we're going to want to center those with items center that should center them vertically. And we're also going to want to make sure that our text is the right font weight. So class name equals font semi-bold should make those the right weight. And of course, we want to split them with a bit of a gap. So I'm going to say gap 4 to make sure our text is split from our icon. We're gonna have some padding around these. So it looks like it's gonna be 8 pixels top and bottom, PY2, PX3 is going to give us 12 pixels to the left and right. And then we're also going to have the same outline effect that we've been seeing in our other items as well. So we'll just directly create an outline since we don't need to have any other kind of backgrounds or anything like that. We can say outline, outline 2, and then we want it to be the right color. So we'll say outline white /10, and that should make it the right color. The border radius we can bring in with rounded large, and that will allow these items to have that border that we see in our design. Now we're going to want one line of these to be stretched on the top and one line of these to be stretched on the bottom, which kind of means that we need to almost create another couple of components here because we have essentially the same thing being repeated twice. Now we could create that component inside our about section, or we could go ahead and create a separate component. But since we've been keeping all of our components within our components folder, let's just go ahead and see if we can go ahead and create a toolbox items component. So I'm going to say toolbox items.tsx, and we're going to say export const toolbox items equals, and then return obviously some JSX. Inside of this about, I'm going to go ahead and look at what we're doing here. So it looks like we want to contain all of our toolbox items in here, and we could make each toolbox item its own separate component. But since we're repeating the whole thing, I think what we're going to have to do is just basically ask for the toolbox items as a prop, and then we'll map over them, we'll apply all the styles, and that should help us do everything correctly. So I'm going to just basically cut and paste that inside of our reusable toolbox items component. This toolbox items we know is going to come in as a prop, so toolbox items. And then we also need to import our tech icon. So import tech icon from /tech icon. And we need to type out these toolbox items. We know each of these are going to have a title and an icon type. So this is going to be an object. Basically for toolbox items is going to be an object. Each of those items is going to have a title, which is a string, an icon type, which is also a string. And then of course, it's just going to be an array of those. And now it's telling me that my component is not correct. And that's true. The icon type isn't really a string. It's actually an element type. So let's change that to React.element type. That should make TypeScript happy. So essentially what I just told it is whatever my toolbox items, when it comes in that array, it's going to be this object and an array of those. That's what that TypeScript type is talking about there. So we have our toolbox items inside of a specific component. So let's come back to our about page and basically go ahead and use our toolbox items and pass in our toolbox items prop. And in fact, I don't like the name of this prop, so I'm going to come back and just change that. I'm going to call that items. Just seems a little bit simpler that way. I'm going to change that items. Okay, there we go. And then inside here, of course, I want to say items as well. So we just changed the name of that prop a little bit. When we scroll down so we can see this again, we can see that it does do the same thing. So essentially we don't have any additional styling on our toolbox items yet. And that's fine. We weren't intending to do that. We just wanted to get away from repeating it twice without using it as a component. So I'm actually going to come in here and just duplicate this. And then it becomes much easier to repeat this again without copying and pasting a bunch of code. So anytime we're copying and pasting code, we want to keep it dry, which means do not repeat yourself, or at least if you do declaratively repeat yourself, make sure you're using a component so that it makes it much, much easier to go ahead and do that. Now for each of these toolbox items, we can come into our component and we can start to style how these are going to be presented within our div. So the first one is going to be this div right here is going to wrap around all of our toolbox items and ensure that we're not showing anything left and right. We're going to need another div inside there that's going to control the spacing between them and make sure that they're all flexed. So I'm going to give this a class name of flex. And of course we want to say flex none so it can continue to grow outside of the page. And this one is going to say class name equals flex. And this is just basically to allow this flex none to actually happen, which allows this to continue to grow outside of our container. On this outer container, we want to say that this is what is going to be hiding the content of our toolbox items. So we're going to give this a mask. So we're going to say mask image, linear gradient to right, and it's going to go from transparent to black at 10%, to black at 90%, to transparent again, and that should allow that to hide on the left and the right side. Anything position related should come in with a class name. What I'm seeing here is that we have the content of this card is coming all the way out to the sides of the card, but the header is actually, has the padding enabled for it. So instead of giving negative margin, we could approach this two ways. Number one, we could go ahead and give negative margin to our card content. And number two, we could go ahead and give our card 0 padding and put all of the padding in the card header itself. I think I like that second option better, so I'm going to go with that. I'm going to come back to my about card. I'm going to go ahead and give it the proper height first of all. So class name equals H, and I think if we scroll up a little bit, it was 320, so 320 pixels. After I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my card header can take a class name. So I'm going to go into my card header component, and let's see if this can take a class name. It currently can't. So let's go ahead and add the ability for that to happen by saying class name here, and that's going to be optional. So class name is going to be an optional string. And then I'm going to use my TW merge to say that we're going to merge whatever this outer class name is with whatever the component user wants to give it. So I'm going to use my TW merge to merge my Tailwind classes, the current ones, with the class name prop that comes in. So I've just given this the ability to use a class name. Now let's try and actually use it. Coming back to my about section, in my toolbox, I want to say that my card has padding of 0. So I'm going to say P0 to override my padding there. And then my card header is going to have a class name of PX6 to give my left and right padding, and then PT6 to give my top padding. Once I save that, we should see that my cards or my tool items now stretch out to the left and right for the entirety of the card. One of the things that I'm also seeing is that each of these toolbox items divs is also, it has a little bit of space at the top and bottom where it's cutting off my outer outline. So let's see how we can handle that inside of my toolbox items component. So for each of those items, they do have a little bit of an outline, of course. Let's see if we can just add something else that's going to make sure that we don't have any problems here. And let's just try and add a little bit of top and bottom padding to each of these by just saying PY 0.5, and let's see if that enables those outlines to show. And indeed, it does, which is definitely helpful for us being able to use those. In fact, to make this even more flexible and ensure that we never have this overridden by passing in a class name to this component, which I think we're going to eventually want to do to be able to use spacing on this, I'm going to actually just move this into here, this flex component, to ensure that we can not override any padding on the top and bottom of our component. We're also going to want to do the same thing inside here. So we'd want to accept a class name here as well. This is just so we can add some margin to the top of this toolbox items without having to bring this into our reusable component. So we don't want any implementation details essentially to be inside of our component. This class name is going to be typed the same way it was before. It's going to be an optional string. So that's what that question mark means. That means it's optional. And then we're going to use TW merge to bring that in as well. So TW merge is going to merge what we have, our class names, with what is going to come in from our component usage. And that's how that's going to be written. So we're just going to merge the string of classes that we have with the ones that come in. And TW merge basically ensures that if we need to override any of these classes with what we're bringing in, that's what TW merge is there for. So it's going to merge those together, but it's also going to make sure that it's going to remove anything here that would be overridden right here. So that is a very helpful utility to use, especially if you're using Tailwind CSS, which of course we are. Back in our about section, let's see if we can set each of these toolbox items components with a class name to add some upper margin. So I'm going to give this a class name of MT6 and see if that allows us to properly do that. And it looks like it does. And I'm going to do the same thing here. So class name equals MT6. And that should move all of our items down. For the spacing between the items, we haven't added that yet either. So let me come back into my toolbox items. And for this flex here, I'm going to say gap 6, and that should add the spacing in between my different items. Now for the gradient that you see inside of our icon, we can't do this the same way we do text gradients. So normally for a text gradient, what we'll do is we'll add a background gradient, kind of like we've done up here for our eyebrow. We added a background gradient and then just made the text transparent, and we made it clipped to the text, and that essentially did this gradient text. For icons, they're a little bit different because they're SVGs, so we have to approach these a little bit different. So let me show you what we're going to do. Inside of our tech icon component, we need to add another SVG to this so that we can use it to style our gradient. Let me show you what I mean here. So first I'm going to wrap this in a React fragment. Inside of that React fragment, I'm going to include another SVG. Now that SVG is literally there just to give us the ability to insert our linear gradient. So I'm going to say linear gradient. That's going to have an ID of tech icon gradient. And then that linear gradient is going to define some stops. So the first stop that it's going to define is going to say offset equals 0. And then it's going to have a stop color. Now that stop color is going to be equal to the start of our gradient, which is of course going to be our emerald 300. So in order to find out what that is, I'm just going to add text emerald 300 here, and let's see if we can find out what that actual color is. It looks like it's this RBG 110, 231, 183. So I'm just going to copy and paste that into here, and that gives us that color. And then the ending stop is going to be text sky 400. Let's just go ahead and take this other one off so it doesn't conflict. And then let me just go ahead and hover this, and it looks like this is this RGB value here. So I'm going to add in another stop. Offset is going to be equal to 100%. The stop color is going to be equal to that RGB value. And that defines this other SVG that has this linear gradient. Well, then how can we actually use this? Well, we can fill an SVG with the ID of a linear gradient that we've defined elsewhere on the page. We're defining it right here. So we can fill this SVG here with, and actually we also need to add a class here so we make sure this is small. So I'm going to say class name equals size 0. And that should allow it to just be there without having to show up anywhere. And even better than that will be just to add hidden so that it just doesn't display at all. And then inside here, we're just going to say fill, and we're going to pass it a custom URL of tech icon gradient. But when we save, it looks like now our icon isn't showing up at all. And that looks like that's because this is actually hidden from view. So instead of making it not work, and to ensure that we don't have extra spacing, what I'm going to do is just absolutely position it. That should ensure it doesn't take up any extra space. It doesn't show up on the screen because it's size 0. And it allows us to be able to use that linear gradient to fill our component with that linear gradient. So now we get this nice gradient SVG instead of the original SVG we had that was just white. Coming back into our about section so that we can go ahead and adjust this bottom toolbox items, we're going to want to add another class name to that. And let's try a negative translate. So I'm going to do negative translate x by 1/2. And that should bring it over. The only problem is it's not translating the actual items themselves, it's translating the entire toolbox. That's not quite what we want. So we need to add a way for us to be able to add a class here so that we can translate the entire flexed items over to the left. So in order to do that, we're going to add another prop here, and we're going to say items wrapper class name. And then we're going to define that the same way within our TypeScript. So that's going to be an optional string. And then we're going to use the same TW merge to make sure that anything we add here gets merged into the rest of our classes. And we're going to say items wrapper class name on there. So we added the ability to be able to add a class name onto this inner div by adding this items wrapper class name prop. Coming back into my about, now we need to say items wrapper class name, and that's going to be equal to this negative translate. And let's see if that fixes our issue. And indeed, it looks like it does. The difference between the two is going to be basically that we haven't added any padding to the right. So we have a gap between all of these, but when we try and infinitely scroll these, we haven't added any padding to account for the extra gap that's not going to be at the end, but is going to be before the beginning of the next set of these toolbox items. So all I need to do is go back here, and I need to say over here, we have gap 6. Let's do padding right 6, and hopefully that will add the padding that we needed to see on the end of this toolbox items div. Now that we have our toolbox items looking pretty good, let's just ensure that we have the right amount of spacing between each of our cards by coming back up to our wrapper and giving this a gap and probably a flex call as well. So I'm going to say flex call to be able to control each of these cards. And then I'm going to say gap 6, and let's see if that is the right amount of spacing. Just by going ahead and doing it, it doesn't look like it's quite right. Let's see if gap 8 is the right amount of spacing. That looks like it is right. So now let's do a quick overlay and see if our first 2 cards are correct. And they do look like they are pixel perfect. Now it's time to move on to our third card. Now let's move down to the Beyond the Code section. So we know that we have a list of hobbies, and we're going to be showing them in this kind of just array of different hobbies that are listed here. So I'm going to go ahead and move my design over to side by side so that we can see that and we can style these up, and then we can move them into position with our different absolute positions. So that's how we're going to do that. For each of these, we need to add a class name to these. And of course, they're going to be inline flex because we want the ability to change the gap or spacing between the emoji and the text itself. That's going to be gap 2 to put 8 pixels of spacing there. And let me make sure my page is refreshed so it's loading what I'm doing here. Okay, so we have that gap 2 there. We also want there to be some spacing to the left and right. So we're going to say px6 to put 24 pixels of spacing to the left and the right. We want the background to have that same gradient. So we're going to say bg gradient to right, and it's going to go from our emerald 300 to our sky 400. That's been our gradient the entire time, and we want it to be rounded full so that we have the full border radius, almost like that pill-like effect. We also want some padding top and bottom. That's going to be py 1.5 to put 6 pixels of padding to the top and the bottom. Inside of our, and I'm going to go ahead and flip on word wrap as well so we can see all these classes. Inside of our title, we're going to add some classes to it as well. So for our title, we're going to say class name equals, and we're going to say font medium to knock up the font weight. And then of course, text gray 950 will set our font color. Now that we have those rules in there, it looks like we pretty much have these exactly as they should be. Let me double check and make sure our font size is good, but I think that is good. And we want to make sure that we are flexing this inline center as well. So let me just double check that we have items center so that nothing changes there. But it looks like that was already taken care of. It looks like that was already centered. So that wasn't a big deal because these are both the same font size. So they both have the same line height. Now that that is done, the next part is getting them to be positioned where they should be positioned. And since we're mapping over these, it would be really nice if we could store that position alongside our hobbies array so that we could just drop that as a custom style on each of our different hobbies. And in fact, we can do that. So let's see how we can do that by just going ahead and coming up to this hobbies array. So we're going to say left is going to be a string, and also top is going to be a string for each of these. And then we're just going to drop that into an inline style for that particular hobby. So I'm just going to go ahead and select my emoji text, and I'm going to continue to select that all the way down. And then I'm going to say left and top, and that will allow us to put that there. Now, just so that we can understand what this is doing, I'm going to also just set this to, let's say 50%, and this one to 50%. That probably won't be the value because it's right over here on the left, but just so that we can see one of these go to where it's supposed to go. So I'm going to come back to my hobbies, and I'm going to position these absolute. In order to position these absolute, of course, I'm going to want to position my parent div as relative. So I'm going to say class name equals relative. And we also want the height of this card to be the same as the other one. So class name equals, and we're going to say H, a custom value of 320 pixels. That will make the height of the card correct. And then we will need to make sure that we have this within the right space within our card. So we have the same kind of issue that we had in our card header on the one above, and that is that you can see that a couple of these are coming outside to the left and outside to the right of our card boundaries, at least our card padding boundaries. So it looks like we're going to need to do the same thing where we take the padding off of the card content and actually put it onto the card header. So I'm going to try and do that by just saying P0, and that should take the padding off of the card content. And then for the card header, I'm going to pass a class name into this, and we're going to use the same padding that we used up here. So it looks like it was PX6, and we're also going to say PT6, and that should add the padding onto there. Now, I don't know, we may have also had some padding on the bottom here because a couple of these, it looks like there's nothing right here. So we may need to go with a PY6 in this case, just to get those initial hobbies down in the area that they should be in. The other thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to flex this div so that we make sure that it takes up the rest of the space below our header. So we're going to want to make the entire card flexed in the column direction. And then this relative is, we're going to tell it that it should grow by saying flex1, and that will allow it to grow over the entire space. We can test this by coming down into our hobby and going ahead and adding those inline styles. So I'm going to say style equals, and then we're going to say left is going to be hobby.left, and top is going to be hobby.top. And that should allow us to see that. And you can see that our painting was set 50% from the top and 50% from the left. Now that's not really where it goes, but we can see that since that's happening, we can tell that this relative container is taking up the correct amount of space. If we didn't know that and we needed to verify that, we could also pull up our inspector and we could see where we needed, let's pull this to the bottom and let's see if we can go ahead and inspect this element. And yes, you can see that it's taking up the correct amount of space because you can see that right here, it's taking up that 343 by 188. So I'm going to close that out and we're going to get back to our coding here. Now all we need to do is come back up to our hobbies array and make sure that we're adding the correct values to push these different hobbies to the right position. So based on the design, it looks like the painting is not 50 by 50. It might be left 5%, top 5%, and we'll check that when we come and bring the design and overlay it on top of our coded template. For photography, we need to get the left for that one. So that looks like the top value is going to be 5% and the left value is going to be 50%. And then we can see if that looks right via the design, and it does appear to be correct based on what the design looks like right now. For gaming, that should be left 10% and top 35%. For hiking, that should be left 35% and top 40%. For our music, that should be left 70% and top 45%. For fitness, it looks like that is left 5% and top 65%. And then for reading, it looks like that is left 45% and top 70%. Now that should be the full list of hobbies. The only thing I'm seeing that's a little bit different is that some of these are overlapping other ones, not necessarily the way that the design is. So the only one that I'm seeing right now that's doing that is that gaming is over hiking, but in our coded template, hiking is over gaming. So the way that we can change that is we can just move gaming after hiking, and that will make sure that it overlays hiking on our template. So now if we go ahead and overlay our reference design on top of our code, we can see that it does indeed line up perfectly, which is exactly what we're after, which means we can move on to our next part of our about section. Let me pull my design back out, and then we're going to see how we're going to create this one. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is set our card to the right height. So I'm going to give this a class name of H with a custom value of 320 pixels. And that will enable that card to be the right height. And then I'm also going to say P0, and that's going to set the padding to 0. For our image, I'm going to give this a class name of H full and width full to ensure that it covers 100% of my card. And of course, I can also say object cover, and that should ensure that it stays at the right aspect ratio given the image size. For this image that we're putting on top, this smile emoji, we can go ahead and wrap a div around it because of course we're going to have some other things going on around it with the image inside of it, and we can give this a class name of absolute. In order for that to happen though, we need a relative container. So I'm going to go ahead and make that absolute, and then I'm going to make the container around it, the card, relative so that it shows up as absolute. And I also want to make sure that it is top 1/2, left 1/2, and then negative translate X 1/2 and negative translate Y 1/2. And hopefully that will show it in the center of our page. The actual image itself is going to be 80 by 80. So we're going to add a class name onto that. And that we're going to tell that to be H20 or size 20. And that should ensure that it is the right size. The surrounding div is also going to be size 20. And that's only because the Memoji has a lot of space around it already. And of course, it's also going to be rounded full. And that will ensure that it has the full border radius. We need to put a background on the surrounding div. So I'm going to say BG gradient to right, and that's going to go from our emerald 300 to our sky 400, and that should put the proper background on that. In order to get this darker border that you see on the outside right here, we can do that with an outline, kind of similar to how we're doing this outlined border over here. So that outline is going to be added onto this outer absolutely positioned element. We're going to use an after element to add that on there. So I'm going to say after content and go ahead and give that some custom content. I'm also going to say the after element is absolutely positioned, that it is after is inset 0, that after has an outline, and also that after has outline 2. So make sure that it is the width of 2. We need to make sure that the after element also has a negative outline offset of 2 to bring it inside of our circle. And we want to add the full border radius to that as well. So after rounded full should do the trick there. And then the only thing we need to add is the color. So that's going to be where the after has an outline of gray 950 with an opacity of 30. So it's basically almost black with a 30% opacity, and that's what's going to give it that little bit of that extra circle effect that we see on our card. If we switch over to the overlaid view, let's see what happens when we put our design on our overlay. It looks like there's a little bit of a shift in the actual image itself, but I'm not really worried about that. Now that we've got everything looking good, let's go ahead and overlay our design on top of our project and see if it still looks as good as we think it does, and if it's actually pixel perfect. I'm going to move that around just a little bit so that we can get that to aligned. So it looks like there's a little bit of a shift in our image, and it looks like that's only because our object fit is centered and we need it to be left top. At least that's what it looks like in the design. So I'm going to say object left top, and that's going to align our image to the left top of this card instead of directly in the center, which is a little odd, but this works for what I'm doing, and it definitely makes it pixel perfect, which is certainly what I'm after here. Now that we have the mobile view pixel perfect to our design, it's time to move on to our responsive views and see what we need to do on the tablet and the desktop size. So I'm going to make sure that my browser is adjusted, and I'm going to take my overlaid image and move it to the side and then look at what I need to do to adjust my tablet view to get it to look like my design. So if I come over here, you can see that we start having this bento card look. And essentially what we're going to do is make this essentially take up 2/5 of the space and this take up 3/5 of the space. The screen size is a little small yet to take up 1/3 and 2/3. So this is going to be a 2/5 and 3/5. And then below that, we're going to have this the opposite where we have 3/5 and then 2/5 of the space. So coming back over to our page, we can see that we don't have that working yet, but of course that isn't that hard to add in here. So let's come up around our cards, and we're going to add a grid to the top 2 cards, and we're going to add a grid to the bottom 2 cards. So I'm going to give a div around our top 2 cards. And then with that div, I'm going to say class name equals grid, and then grid calls 5 should ensure that there's 5 columns. Now we only wanted to show up this way on the medium size, so I'm also going to add that medium modifier to anything that we do right here because we don't want this happening too soon. Inside of here, we want this card to span 2 columns. So I'm going to say call span 2. And then for the other card, we want it to span 3 columns. So I'm going to say call span 3, and that should ensure that they span the correct number of columns. And then in between those columns, we still want there to be that gap of 8. So I say medium gap 8 to ensure that we have the gap between those as well. Let me make sure that these column spans are set up correctly. They have the medium modifiers on them as well. So let's go back and look at what we have in our design versus what we were seeing in our page, and it looks like those are pretty similar. Let me just double check by putting our design overlaid on top. And yes, it looks like those are still pixel perfect. Let me go ahead and bring the opacity down, bring this over here so we can really see what's going on. Okay, so not quite as perfect as we want. And some of that has to do with the amount of padding that we're now going to be using in our design. So our design, let me bring the opacity of that up a bit so we can kind of see that a little bit better. But as you can see, the text size and the padding size on these cards adjusts a little bit in this size. So we need to adjust with it by going ahead and bringing our padding sizes up, and that should push some of our content down on these cards. The card height stays the same, but the padding changes a little bit. So let me go ahead and do that. Now, as you can see, we have some padding in our card. So if I go to my card component, I actually have this padding being added. If I want to go ahead and toggle the word wrap on this, so you can see this. You can see that we're adding 24 pixels of padding around our card, and that's actually constraining the card header. But in almost every instance, we actually don't want the padding to come around the card content. We only want it to be around the card header. So it may have been smarter to remove this padding from here and actually add it to our card header. And in fact, let's go ahead and see if that works by going ahead and removing our padding 6 that's coming from our card. And let's go ahead and add that to our card header and see if that is helpful for us at all. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to say P6 as my default on my card header. And in most cases, I don't think it changes because we were already custom adding that padding on for our other two cards that used the header. So let me come back into my About section. I'm going to remove this P0 because we don't need it anymore. And I'm also going to remove this PX6 and PT6 and see if that makes any difference here. And it looks like the only thing that it's going to do is we're going to see that extra MT6 on top here. So let's go ahead and remove that and see if our content scoots up like it should. And the same is going to be true of our book where we're saying MT8. That's no longer going to be needed. In fact, it's just going to come down a little bit to MT2. That should push our book down where we need it to be. So let's go back to our mobile view, make sure we didn't mess anything up. Let's go ahead and scroll this around a little bit and double check by putting our design out to our side if there was anything that was a problem with what we just did. And it looks like the other thing that it seems to have messed with is our testimonials, because those were relying on our cards actually having some amount of padding. So let's go back to our testimonials section and go ahead and edit that as well to make sure that our testimonials have the right amount of padding. So we're using our card right here, and we're saying when they get to the medium size, they're P8, but they need to be P6 by default in order to make them the right size. And let's see if that lines those up again. It does look like it does. And if we come back down, it looks like everything should be in line right here, except for the gap in between our different cards. So let's double check on that. I'm going to close this testimonials, come back to my About. I know it's a little bit of flipping around here, and look at what we're doing here. So we have this gap 8 with this flex of call. Oh, of course, because we put this grid here, now this grid is controlling the spacing between our columns, or there's just having this div here is ensuring that we don't have spacing between these flex columns anymore. So we're going to have to change this around a little bit to ensure that we still have spacing between these even at the smallest size. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and put the grid on there, but at the small size, it's going to be grid calls 1. Now, if we only have one column, that means that anything that's within here will take up the full space, and then we can just say gap 8, and that should ensure that anything between there, even on the y-axis, will still have that same amount of spacing. And then when we get to the medium size, we're just going to switch into columns 5, and now we don't even need the medium modifier on gap 8 because gap 8 is already going to be there for that grid, and it's showing me that we don't need that there. I don't think there's anything else that was kind of messed with because we switched our way that we're doing our card padding, but let me double check and overlay this real quick just to ensure there wasn't anything else that we messed up by going ahead and moving that card padding into our card header, and it doesn't look like there was. So that's good news. Let's go back to our tablet view and let's see what we need to do here to ensure that we now have the proper spacing here. Now that we moved that padding into our card header, we should be able to change it all at once as well. Now that we have our P6 here. So what we're going to do is when this is the medium size, we're going to go ahead and give it a little bit more padding on the top and bottom with PY8, and then a lot more padding on the left and right with PX10 at the medium size. Let's go ahead and give that a medium modifier as well. And let's see if that looks like what we see in our design. I'm going to go ahead and drag our design over, and let's see if it looks like it is the same as we had it before. So then the difference is our book, which we have a modifier on to give it a little more margin on the top, but we're going to go ahead and remove that for the medium size because the book can then come up against our header. So let me go back to, let me X out of my card header, X out of my tech icon and toolbox items, and even my card, and just come back to my about, and let's go to our book. So this book has an MT2 modifier. We need to go ahead and say at the medium size, MT0 is what we want to bring that book up just a little bit. And let's go ahead and see if that looks correct. And it does. Looks pixel perfect with the design versus what we're seeing on our screen. So we need to apply some of those same changes to the grid that should surround these next two cards. So we have a card right here. We have a card right here. I'm just going to fold those up so it's easier to see. So we're going to add another grid to these as well. So I'm going to say div class name equals grid to these other two cards. We're going to give that a gap of 8 as well. For those grid items, we're going to make sure that it has grid calls 1 on the mobile size, but then when we move up to our medium size, we want grid calls 5. And then for our card, we're going to say call span 3 for the first one, and for the second one, we're going to say call span 2. And that should make sure that we have this 3-2 and then 2-3 arrangement going on. Let's double check and see if our design still matches what we have here. And it looks like it does. Pixel perfect once again. So let's go ahead and give this a quick overlay by going ahead and switching this to overlay and switching this opacity to 50%, just so we can see if there's any difference, but I'm not seeing any difference right here. So this looks good. And coming over to the desktop view, we also want to go ahead and see if there are any changes that we need here. I'm going to pull out my browser just a little bit more, put in my sidebar to give us a little bit more room for our code, and then just take a look and see if there are any changes that we need to make. So let me go ahead and overlay my image, which it looks like it is right now, and pull down the opacity. And yes, it does look like there are some changes that we're going to have to make on this view. So I'm going to put this side by side just so we can double check and see what those changes are. The first one seems like we definitely need to take the padding up a bit on the top and bottom. So the section padding up here is a little bit bigger than it is in our coded page. So let's go to our about section and add that by giving this a large modifier. So at the large size, let's set this to PY, let's try 28 and see if that makes it equal to what we see in our design. So let me go back to overlaid and let's see if that makes it equal. And it does look like it does. The other thing that we're going to have to worry about is in this size, we're going to change up how we do our grid. So instead of our 2, 3, 3, 2, now we're going to go with 3 columns. So if we can look at that again, let's see the side by side. This is a 2, 3. And then over here, we're actually making the my reads a little smaller, making my toolbox a little bit bigger. So let's go ahead and add those modifiers in as well. Here's the first grid. We're going to say a large grid calls 3. And then on the large size, our internal cards here, which I'm going to fold those up just so we can see them a little bit easier. Our internal cards are going to be large call span 1. And then the second one is going to be large call span 2. And that should ensure that that is correct. Move back over so we can see that. And then we need to do the same thing below here. So this will be a large grid calls 3 to make 3 columns. And then we're going to say large call span 2. And then on the bottom one, large call span 1. And that should ensure that they all show up nicely next to each other. Now I am noticing that this call span 3 did not have a medium modifier on it. So let me go ahead and add the medium modifier to that one. And I'm also going to add the medium modifier to the one below it, just to make sure that those show up correctly on the mobile version. So let me try overlaying this again and seeing if there are any differences. It still looks like there are, which leads me to believe that there are other things that we're going to need to worry about at this size. So let me go ahead. There's nothing in the header that's a problem. In fact, it looks like we may have some sort of text size change as well as, let me just double check on this. I'm gonna go ahead and update our image opacity, our overlaid image opacity, just to see. I'm gonna pull this over and just see what the change is. So yes, the text size definitely does get larger. The description size, the title size doesn't, but the description size does. And that does look like it changes things, as well as it looks like it has a max width added to it. So instead of going out over the entire card, you can see under my toolbox, it actually just goes out a little bit and then it wraps around. So there's some sort of max width added there as well that's changing the way that our view looks on the large size. So let me go ahead and come into our code and see how we can manage those. That'll be inside of our card header. That's a great thing about these reusable components, is that we can change things once and change them for all of the places that we use them. So we had text small inside of our component, but now we know in the large size, we're probably going to have text base, and that's going to make the text the right size. And we can double check that just by pulling this back and seeing if it's the right size. It looks like it is, but now we have to deal with that max width wrapper as well. Let's try to add a max width extra small on there and see if that does it. I'm going to pull this back and see if there's any changes. It doesn't really look like there are. We are seeing a little bit of it. We're seeing this JavaScript piece go away, but we're going to fix that whenever we go to our animation. So I'm not that worried about that. And let's see if there's any other changes as we scroll down that are different from our design. I'm not seeing anything right offhand. So that means that we have a pixel perfect design once again, which is exactly what we're after. And that means we're also done with the About section before animations, and we can move on to our call to action. Now that we finished up with the About Me section, we're moving into the call to action section, which is a fairly simple call to action box. It does have a little bit of a green effect over a transition or background gradient, so we'll have to make sure and ring that in. But other than that, this is a pretty simple call to action section. On the tablet view, we're going to go ahead and put these side by side, so we'll have to be mindful of that when we create this component. And then on the desktop view, we're going to just spread those out, but still make sure that those are side by side. So that wraps up the design for this section. Let's go ahead and dive into the code. The first thing we're going to do inside of our page.tsx is bring in our contact section. So let's go ahead and import our contact section from section/contact and then drop that into the bottom of our page as contact section here. If everything works, we should be able to see that it drops some text in the bottom of the page, and it does look like that worked. So we can go into our contact section and work from there. Inside of our contact section, we're going to want to bring in the H2 that says, let's create something amazing together. Under that, we're going to want there to be a paragraph that says, ready to bring your next project to life. Let's connect and discuss how I can help you achieve your goals. And we're also going to want a button in this section. I'm going to drop in a button tag, and that's going to say contact me. And there's also going to be an arrow here as well. So I'm going to have to import that arrow up right icon from @/assets/icons/arrow up right. And that will allow us to drop this in next to our contact me text. Since we do want to control this spacing between these, I'm going to go ahead and add a span around our text and then drop in the icon under that. So I'm going to say arrow up right icon, and that should allow that to be dropped in there. Let's move our design out to the side so it makes it a lot easier to see. So I'm going to go ahead and put this to side by side, and then we can see that, yes, we do indeed see that this is starting to show up down here, and then we have all of our content for this section right here. In order to start styling it up, let's go ahead and wrap our content in a container. So I'm going to say div class name equals container to move it from the edges of the screen. And then we also want a little bit of padding on the top and bottom. So I'm going to give this a class name of py16. That should give the proper padding on the top and bottom of this section. We do want there to be a background gradient around the entirety of our content for this section. So I'm going to create another div inside our container, and I'm going to give this a class name as well. And that div is going to have our background gradient. So I'm going to say bg gradient to right from emerald 300 to sky 400, and that should take care of that. We're also going to want our text to be gray 900. So I'm going to say text gray 900 here. That should ensure that our text is the right color. For the card itself, we do want there to be some padding here. So let's try py8 for 32 pixels of padding on the top and bottom, and px10 for 40 pixels of padding on the left and right. And if we say rounded 3xl, that should give the border radius that we need in order to make it like our design. The other things I'm seeing is that everything in this card is centered. Let's just go ahead and create a text center class right here and see if that centers our text. And it looks like it does, which will be helpful as we continue to move forward. For our title, we're going to want this to say a class name of font serif, because this is our header font. And we're going to want to update the font size as well. So we're going to say text 2XL. That will create a larger font size that we need for this card. For the text, the paragraph text, we actually want this text to be smaller. So I'm going to say class name equals text small, and that should make the text smaller. And then we're going to say MT2, and that should put 8 pixels of margin on the top of that text between that text and that title. And then for the button, we're also going to want to include classes for that. So I'm going to give this a class name, and then I'm going to add some button style. So we want the text to be white in this case. We want the BG to be gray 900. We want the whole button to be inline flexed, and of course the items to be aligned to the center. And then we want some padding to left and right. So I'm going to say PX6, if I'm not mistaken there. And then we're going to give it a height of 48 pixels with H12. And then we'll use rounded XL for the border radius on that button. The text itself is going to be a little bit thicker than we currently see. So I'm going to say class name equals font semi-bold, and that should ensure that the text is the right weight. And then the arrow itself is going to be a size of 16 pixels. So I'm going to say class name equals size 4, and that will ensure that the arrow is the right size. It's going to knock that down. There's going to be a gap in between our text and our arrow, and that's going to be a gap of 8 pixels. And that's just going to spread that out a little bit. And then we're going to also add a margin to the top of this, and that's going to be MT8, and that should ensure that we have that 32 pixels of margin between the top of our card and the top of our content. Now there's a little bit of difference. We have been using the PY16 on all of our sections except for the last one, and we added a little bit of extra spacing between the end of the last section and the beginning of this one. So we'll just account for it, I think, with this section just by saying PT and bring this up a little bit. Let's see if we can do maybe a 14, and maybe that'll bring it up enough to be even with our card over in our design. And that looks like it is indeed even with that, which is great. The other thing that I would like to do is go ahead and add the grain on top of our card, but of course under our content. So in order to add that, we're going to need to make our card relative, and then we're going to need to add in an absolutely positioned element, div class name equals absolute inset 0, and this is going to hold the grain image. So let's import our grain image. I'm going to import our grain image from @/assets/images/grain.jpg, and then we can drop that into our styles. So style equals background image, and that's going to be a URL of grain image.source. This is actually very similar to our card. I wonder if it would have been better for us to just use our card instead of putting this grain image on top of this and just changing the background and outline of our card. I'm not sure that it is, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with this approach, but that was just a thought in my mind. So I'm going to say this is opacity of, well, first of all, let's say opacity 50, just so we can see what's going on. I'm going to change that to opacity 5, but inside of our card, I'm going to say overflow hidden to ensure that we don't have any grain sticking out past the edges of the card. And then I also want to give this, if I change my word wrap here, I want to give this a Z index of 0 to reset our Z index so that we can move this into the negative Z index. So I'm going to say negative Z10, and that should pull the grain below our content, which it does. We can see, especially on the button, it shows it's below the content, and then we can just change this to opacity 5, and that just gives that real nice light grain effect that just gives it a little bit more depth and feel than it would if it were just plain. Let's overlay the design on top of our coded page and see if we have everything correct. Let me see if PT12 will help us to get our card to the right spot. It looks like it does, so I'm going to leave this as PT12, and hopefully our card will stay in the right spot versus the design. Now that we have our call to action done in our mobile view, let's move over to the tablet view, and let's see what we need to do in order to get this to show up correctly. I'm going to go ahead and pull out my browser window a little bit to allow us to see the tablet view and full width. And then I'm going to close my primary sidebar on my IDE to allow our code a little bit more room to breathe. So we have a little bit of a change in the font size, and we also need to put the button over to the right. So if we look at what we have now, this is what we have. And if I increase my design image opacity, my overlay opacity here, we'll see that this is what we should have. Larger text for both the title and the description. And of course, we want to move these right to left instead of top to bottom. Now, how we're going to approach this is right now we have our button following our paragraph and our title. All of that should probably flex these top to bottom so that we can then change these to a flexed row. So I'm going to go ahead and add a div class name equals flex and flex call, because that's what we want on our mobile view. And then we can change this when it gets to the medium size. And then instead of the MT8 on our button or margin top 8, we can just say gap 8 here, and that will take care of the mobile view the way that we want it to look. So let's come back to, and we should also go ahead and wrap our H2 and our paragraph together. So let me go ahead and do that just inside one div so that they stay together and don't get messed up by what we're doing with our buttons. So let's come back to our mobile view and let's see what it looks like. It doesn't quite look correct, and that's because we also probably want to justify everything to the center. At least I believe it's justified to the center. It might be items center. Let's change this to items center. And that should push our button towards the center, which is what we wanted in the mobile view. And then when we get to the tablet view, we can switch this. So instead of flex call in the medium size, we're going to say flex row, and that should allow our button to be beside our text content. Now our text content is no longer going to be centered either. So right now we have this text center over the entire card. We're going to say medium, we're going to say text left, and that will align our text to the left at the medium size. We also want to increase our font size a little bit. So at the medium size, we're going to say text 3XL on our title, and we're also going to say medium size text base on our description, and that should bring those up enough that it should make it the right size. For our button, we are going to want this to be inside of a div, I believe, so that it doesn't directly get flexed like it's being flexed right now. And hopefully that should allow it to be flexed correctly. I'm still seeing the span tag wrapping here, and I don't want that to happen. Let's see if we can say width max content, and let's see if that actually allows it to be correct. So max content basically says, let this take up the max width that the content would normally take up, and that allows our text not to wrap over here. Now let's see if we have any other adjustments to make. So I'm going to pull in my design versus what I have here, and it looks like there's definitely a little bit of difference in what we're seeing. The text sizes are the same, but it almost looks like the gap is the main thing that changes between our design and what we have in our code. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say gap 2, sorry, not for the button. Let's go into our card, and we currently have gap 8. Let's switch this on the medium size. Let's try gap 16 and see if that's big enough to make the shift that we need. And then we'll go ahead and compare this to our design again. And it does look like that is pretty pixel perfect there. So if I go ahead and overlay, I'm going to pull this slider all the way to the left, and I'm going to overlay my design, which is overlaid. I'm going to pull down the image opacity, and we're just seeing just a tiny bit of border around our button. It looks like our button has a little bit of border, and that's probably what's causing just that tiny little bit of difference there. So let's see if we can add that on. Let's go ahead and add a border onto our button. And then for that border, we're going to say border gray 950. And hopefully that should allow that, or actually 900 because that's the color of the button. And hopefully that should make that look much more the same as the design. So that 1 pixel little change definitely made a difference. Looks like our button did have a border, and that allowed that to show up correctly. Let's take one more look at our desktop view to make sure that everything still looks like it should. So I'm going to pull out my browser a little bit more so that we can see our desktop view in full width. And then I'm going to do a quick comparison to see if there are differences. And it looks like there definitely are differences. Essentially, the difference is in the padding on the top, or the section padding of this particular section. So in order to get that to be correct, I'm just going to put that right in the middle just so I can see if this is right. And then I'm going to come up here and say in the large size, I'm going to say PY 24. And then we also want to say in the large size, we'll say PT 20, and hopefully that will allow that to be exactly accurate. And it does look like it is. So let me just double check one more time and make sure it's pixel perfect. Swiping left, swiping right. I'm seeing that looks really, really good. Let's pull down the image opacity and just see if there's anything when we have kind of this semi-opaque image or this 50% design overlay. That still looks really good. So it matches our reference image, which means our call to action is now correct. Let's move on to the footer. The last part of our page that we have to create is the footer section. So right below the call to action, you're going to see we have a footer with a copyright and a few of our social links. Nothing too crazy here. We're just going to make sure that they are stacked on mobile. As we move over into the tablet view, you're going to see that they're going to be aligned left to right, and they're going to be justified between. And then in the desktop view, we are going to just make sure that they still align to the normal container width. And we also see we have this interesting gradient on the bottom of the page that we want to be sure and include in our page. So we're going to make sure that that gets included as well. That may be on the page itself and not the footer, but we'll see how we can include that and make that look good. Without further ado, let's jump into the code. In order to start creating our footer section, let's go ahead to our page.tsx and let's import that footer. So I'm going to import my footer format/section/footer and then drop it into the bottom of my page like so. If we've done that correctly, we should see the words footer section being shown at the bottom of the page, and that does look like that's happening. So that means that I believe we've hooked up our footer section correctly, which means we can come into our sections/footer and go ahead and start editing this footer section. I am going to pull my browser out a little bit and make sure that my design is not overlaid. It's going to be side by side. My reference image is going to be to the side of my actual content, and that's going to make sure that we can see both of those very well. And I'm going to go ahead and close my sidebar as well, just to give us a little bit more room for our code. Within our footer section, we know that we're going to have a container to hold all of our content. So I'm going to say div class name equals container, and that will hold that. I also want to make this a semantic footer tag. So I'm going to go ahead and change that around real quick. So that's a semantic footer tag. We're going to have the container inside of that. And then in that container, we're going to have two parts of our content. We know that. So I'm going to create two divs inside of a div that we can flex. And on the left, we're going to have our copyright. So I'm going to say and copy to create the copyright symbol, and 2024, all rights reserved. On the other side, we're going to have our YouTube links. So I'm going to create a semantic nav tag here. In fact, I can just make this a semantic nav tag. And in that, I'm going to have my links. So I'm going to have my href equals, and I'm going to put my different links here. I'm going to have 4 of them. So I'll just go ahead and create those. And then inside the first one, I'm going to say YouTube. The second one is going to say Twitter. The third one is going to say Instagram. And the fourth one is going to say LinkedIn. Now what I can do for my footer links, since I'm going to be repeating these links and styles 4 times, I could just go ahead and create an array of footer links and then drop those in or map over those here, which I think is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to come up here to the top of my file and I'm going to say const footer links, and then I'm going to create that array. And then for each of these, we're going to have a title, and then that's going to be there. We're also going to have an href, so I'm going to put that there, and that's also going to be another string, and we're going to have 4 of those. I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, how we can do this, we can kind of copy and paste this. If we go ahead and select all these, we're going to go ahead and copy this word here, and then I'm going to go and select all of my titles. That's Command D on the VS Code IDE on the Mac, and I'm going to paste my text into there, and then I can come down and just go ahead and drop in my hash into the href to allow me to quickly create my footer links array. Inside my nav, I can go ahead and map over the footer links. So I'm going to say footer links.map and then give this a link. And then I'm going to go ahead over here and output a link for each of these different footer links. The text itself will probably wrapped in a span. So I'm going to give a span tag here. I'm going to say link.title. And we also need a key for each of our links to keep React happy. So I'm going to say key equals link.title. Anytime we map over an array, we'll need that. I'm going to remove these other ones that are down here. And we know that for each link, we're also going to have this arrow up right icon. So I need to import that as well. So at the top of my file, I'm going to import arrow up right icon from @/asset/icon/arrow up right.svg. And then we're going to bring that in as a component, saying arrow up right like that, or arrow up right icon, I should say. That will bring in those different icons. So you can see that they now exist in our footer down here on the bottom of the page. Now that we have all of our content on the page, it's time to worry about how we're going to style this up and make this look like the design. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create a border top. So I'm going to come inside my container because I can see that my border is only inside my container. And I'm going to come to this div right here and go ahead and give this a class name. And this one is going to say border T for border top. And that's going to be border white with 15% opacity. We're also going to make sure that it has a little bit of padding top and bottom. So we're going to say PY6 to give it the padding top and bottom. And we're going to go ahead and make all of the text inside this div small with text small to make it that 14 pixel text that we see. We may as well go ahead and add our flex rule onto this div as well. So I'm going to say flex call, and then we're going to say items center, and that should align everything up to the center if we've done that correctly, which it looks like we have. I'm going to go ahead and toggle my word wrap so we can see all those classes without having to scroll left and right. For my all rights reserved text, we want to go ahead and give this a class name as well. And we're going to say text white /40 for 40% opacity white text. And then each of my footer links also needs to have a class name as well. So I'm going to say class name equals, and we're going to make these inline flex. And these different inline flexed items are going to say items center and also gap 1.5 to give it a 6 pixel gap. And then for each of these arrow upright icons, we also need to give that a class name and set the size of these to 4 so that they are 16 pixels in height and width. The text itself needs to be a little bit bolder. So I'm going to say class name here, and I'm going to say font semi-bold, and that should make them the right boldness. And then for all of my footer links together, we're going to need to flex those top to bottom. So let's say class name here and flex call items center. This should push those towards the center of the screen. And let's see how we did. That looks good. We just need a little bit of gap in between them. So gap 8 should do the trick. To create the space between our copyright and our footer links, we also need to add some gap in between the copyright text and all of the links, and that's going to be done with this flexed div here. So I'm going to say gap 8, and that should add some gap in between there as well. So if we scroll up and down, we can see that I think we're right on our spacing. I think we're right on our font sizes and font weights. All of that looks correct. Let me go ahead and overlay my design on top of my footer, and then we'll worry about the gradient that we're seeing on the bottom. So let's go to switch to overlaid, and I'm going to scroll up and down. It looks like that's pixel perfect right now. So I'm going to pull that out back to side by side, and then we'll talk about how are we going to worry about this gradient that we see coming from the bottom of the page. Now, in order to create this gradient, what we're going to do is we're going to create an absolutely positioned div within our footer that's going to be allowed to flow outside of our footer if need be. And I'll show you how that all works. In order to create an absolute position div, of course, we need to have a relative position div to put it inside. So I'm going to say class name here, and I'm going to say relative inside of our footer. And then we're just going to put this absolute position div directly inside of it. We're going to say div class name equals absolute. And that is going to be what contains the gradient that we see over here. Now this absolute position div is going to be kind of interesting because it's going to be very large. So we're going to say that the height of this div is going to be 400 pixels. The width of this div is going to be 1600 pixels. And then we also, just in order to be able to see it, we do want to ensure that it is in the right position. So we're going to say bottom 0. And then from the left, it's going to be left 1/2. And then we're also going to negatively translate it, negative translate x 1/2. That's going to put it in the center. So it's going to be on the bottom in the center. And then just to be sure we actually see it showing up, I'm going to say BG Emerald 300, and we should see this kind of covering the bottom down here. Okay, so that's where our gradient is actually going to be positioned. Of course, we don't want it to look like that. We'll get all of the z-index and of course the radial gradient and all that ironed out with the next rules that we implement. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and create our actual gradient itself. So in order to do this, we're actually going to mask this absolute position element. So we're going to say mask image, and we're going to say radial gradient, and it's going to be 50%, 50% at bottom center. And we're going to go from black to transparent. So essentially we're just creating a simple gradient that's going to overlay this, and it should, yes, make our gradient basically start off from the bottom and then go towards the top. And then in order to essentially reduce the opacity of this, I can just say BG Emerald 300/30. That'll reduce the opacity of that gradient. Now we also don't want this gradient overlaying any of our content. So for this relatively positioned div, we need to go ahead and reset our z-index on that. And since I also don't want it overlaying at all any of our content above here either, I'm actually going to give this a negative z-index. So I'm going to say negative z10 to reset our z-index at -10. And then I'm also going to go ahead and give this a negative z-index. So negative z10, which is relative to essentially this z-index here. So this is negative. This should make it go under our content. And we can double check that just by going ahead and increasing this opacity again and making sure that it doesn't show above our content. Indeed, it does not, which means it's under our content. And that's exactly what we want. I'm going to knock that opacity right back down. Now let me refresh my page and see if we see any kind of errors or warnings showing up that would lead me to believe. And yes, we do see that we have an overlap where we have some content going off of the screen. That's probably due to this absolute position element because we aren't clipping any of the content to the X direction. So if I say overflow X clip, that should ensure that we don't have that problem. Let me refresh my page and see if we still see that saying that there is some overflow. And indeed, we no longer see that warning and we can't scroll left and right, which means the overflow X clip works really well. Now let's briefly talk about why we use overflow X clip rather than overflow hidden here. And we'll can simply show this just by using overflow hidden and showing the difference. So I'm going to say overflow hidden or even overflow X hidden, just to show you what happens. And then you're not going to see much of a difference, but if I knock this back up without this mask image, I'm going to take that off for a second just by cutting it and saving it. And you can see that it doesn't allow it to go above or outside of the parameters of this footer, when in reality, we really want it to go outside of there. So if we say overflow X clip, that will allow it to expand outside of the footer like we want it to be able to do. So I'm going to go ahead and put my mask image back in, use overflow X clip, and that will allow only the left and right directions to be clipped, while it also allows the radial gradient to expand beyond the footer, which is exactly what we would want in this case. Let's go ahead and overlay our design to make sure we didn't miss anything. So I'm going to go ahead and overlay this. I'm going to move this up and down a little bit to ensure that we get that aligned, and it looks pixel perfect. Looks really, really nice. Not seeing any differences as I scrub over it. So I think our mobile design is done for the footer. Let's go ahead and move on to the tablet design. Moving over to my tablet design, I'm going to pull my browser window out just a tiny bit, and we can instantly see that we have a little bit of a problem because now our navigation should be aligned left to right, not top to bottom. So on the medium size, we want to take this navigation and we want to say flex row. So medium flex row should do the trick there. And then we also have another flex container, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, this one's also flexed in the column direction. We also want it to be flexed row. So medium flex row should be the thing that we want to happen there. And then we want this to be justified between as well. So we're going to say medium justify between to push the content to the left and right sides of the screen. So after we do those three things, we can see that we're now seeing this showing up correctly as far as I can tell. Let me do a quick scrub to make sure that we are seeing everything and everything is pixel perfect, and it looks like indeed it is. So I'm happy with where that's at, which means that our tablet is done. Let's move over to our desktop design. On our desktop design, it doesn't look like anything's really changed. Let me go ahead and make sure my image opacity is down, which it is. And let me go ahead and scrub back and forth to see if we have any problems. And I'm going to increase the browser size of my window and just take this and go back and forth just to make sure everything is pixel perfect. But everything, it looks like already was. Everything is aligned already for desktop. So our desktop design is done. We've just created the entirety of this page using a reference image. Now we haven't added any animations yet. That will be the next step, but the entire page is looking amazing on every single device size, in responsive views. Everything is looking amazing. So from here on out, we actually aren't going to use our reference image anymore. All we're going to be worried about are the animations that we're going to add. So I'm actually going to remove all of my reference images and just have my actual content. So I'm going to remove that one. I'm going to remove that one. And for my third one over here, I'm going to remove that reference image because our design is done. Now we're just going to be worried about how do we animate this? How do we make this really pop? So that when clients or hiring managers land on these pages, they can really get a glimpse or a sense of the expertise that we are bringing to the table. So that is what's next. Let's go talk about how to animate this page. Now that we have our entire site statically coded, it's time for us to get to the polish part, which is adding all of our animations. And first, we're going to concentrate on the hero section, which is going to have a combination of animations. We're going to animate the green dot that you see next to available for new projects. And we're also going to animate all of the stars that orbit around the hero section. In order to create these animations, we need to understand how we want to create them and whether we need to use CSS or JavaScript. Now, if we go over to Tailwind's site, and if you haven't done Tailwind CSS Animations before, this might be helpful for you. Let me go ahead and bring up my bottom bar here and talk about Tailwind CSS's animation property. So Tailwind CSS has a few different animations that it provides us right out of the box. In fact, it provides us a spin animation, and it also provides us a ping animation. Well, we could use both of those animations, or at least something like both of those animations, for our hero section in order to create what we want to create. So with that in mind, let's go back and let's see how we can apply these animations to our hero section. We're going to start with the ping. So I'm going to bring up my sections/hero.tsx, and I'm going to close out my sidebar to give our code a little more room to breathe, as well as I'm going to go ahead and word wrap so that we can see all of the classes that we're using. And let's find our ping. So that looks like would be right around here where we have this div with a background of green 500 and then the size of 2.5 for 10 pixels. So that's our little dot that we need to animate. Let's see what happens when we add on the animate ping class. So I'm going to say animate ping and just go ahead and save it. And then let's see what happens. Okay, so we end up with essentially the ping being animated, but then we also want the dot to just be there as well. So that means we need to add another absolutely positioned element behind it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. What I'll end up doing is going ahead and creating a relative div, which is going to be just the dot that we currently see. So I'm going to make this relative, and then I'm going to put our ping animation inside of it. And it's just going to be the same exact size as our rounded dot. I'm going to go ahead and create a div class name equals, and it's going to be BG green 500 again. It's going to be absolute inset 0, which is just going to make it the full 10 by 10 of our current dot. And this is going to be what we'll actually add our animated ping onto. So with that, let's go ahead and try and add our animate ping and see what we think of this animation. Of course, we need to say rounded full so that it is getting that full border radius. So after I save that, I do see that there's a little bit of ping. In fact, I'll make this a little bit easier to see by going ahead and increasing the size of this window. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that and scroll over here. And you can see that yes, indeed it is pinging, but I don't think the ping is as pronounced as I want it to be. This is only a 10 pixel by 10 pixel dot. I would like it if the ping just grew a little bit more to draw a little bit more attention to what's actually going on the page. So we're going to customize this animation value, but we're still going to do it with CSS because I love CSS. When CSS works, it's the best way to render animations. And then when you need to use more complexity, that's when you want to go to JavaScript and libraries that we've used before, like Framer Motion. So I'm going to bring up my sidebar and we're going to see how do we change our Tailwind config so that we can create a better ping animation. What'll really help us here is just seeing what Tailwind CSS's documentation says. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and bring up our bottom browse window again, and I'm going to look at how do we create custom animation values here at the bottom of the page. So we can do a couple of things here. We can use the built-in animations or built-in keyframes and change their duration with something like the spin slow. I don't think that makes any sense. I'll show you why here when we get to our animations. We are going to do essentially this exact same thing, but we're going to do it on a more ad hoc basis. So let's just ignore that for now. But it shows us this. This is interesting. So if we have a keyframe that we want to add on, we can extend keyframes and we can add a custom keyframe value. And then we need to go to our animation and we need to use that keyframe that we just created and basically just give it a duration and whether we want it to repeat infinitely, how we want it to ease, all of those values to create the animation. So this is actually a two-step process. The first is create our custom keyframe. The second is implement that keyframe inside of an animation. Now let's see how they set up their keyframe so that we can understand what changes we want to make to our ping animation. And I'm just going to call this probably something like ping large. If we scroll all the way to the top, it shows us what they did for their animate ping. So it says that we have our keyframe ping and it's going to transform scale of 2 and change the opacity to 0 between the values of 75% and 100%. And then they have this, they're using it in an animation where they just use ping over 1 second and do all this other easing and infinite iteration count. So in order for us to implement something similar, let's go ahead and extend our keyframes and let's go with ping large. And we're going to do something very similar to what they did. So from 75% to 100%, we're going to make sure that the transform is set to scale. It was set to scale 2. We're going to set it to scale 3 to make it even larger. And the opacity is still going to be set to 0. Let me make sure we may have to do just a 0 string. Okay, now that we have our ping large keyframe, now we need our ping large animation. So I'm going to extend animation as well, and we're going to add in a ping large, and that's going to say ping large 1 second, ease in, out, and infinite. That will use our ping large keyframe. It'll do it over 1 second, which we can adjust that duration later. And we can just say a simple ease in out and make sure that it's infinitely repeated. That's what this animation is going to do. So now that we have that custom class, let's come back into our hero. Let's go ahead and put our sidebar down for a second. And instead of animate ping, now we're going to say animate ping large. And the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense does catch that we have that updated config and give us that animate ping large class. And I'm going to put down my browse window and let's take a look at what's happening now. So before you saw that it was a pretty small animation where it was scaling to the size of 2. Now we've increased that by 150% to scale to a size of 3 times whatever that initial value was. So initially we had a 10 by 10 ring. Now it's going up to 30 by 30, which is definitely a bit bigger. So let's see when we zoom out by going over to our size and just double clicking on it. When we zoom out, let's see if that's more pronounced and eye-catching. And indeed, it does look like it is. I like the way that it looks right now. So this is how we're going to leave this animation. Moving on to our stars, we know that these are going to be a little more complex than just a simple ping, but we can still do this with the Tailwind CSS Animations. So we're going to implement Tailwind CSS Animations for these different spinning stars, and let's see how we can generate a great effect with CSS animations here as well. So let's go ahead and scroll over to where we have our stars. So we know that everything is within these hero orbits, and we also have the icons themselves. And there's a couple of things that we're going to have to account for if we want our stars to both independently rotate around themselves and also rotate around their orbit. So let's talk about what those things are. The first thing I want to make sure is that our hero orbit actually takes a class name. So let's go ahead and go over to our hero orbit component, and let's see what options we have with our hero orbit. And let me go ahead and put back my sidebar so we can see this. And I'm going to also toggle my word wrap so we can see all the classes. So we have an orbit, and it has these absolutely positioned containers. These containers are holding in these flex containers with a specific size, and then those are holding in these inline flex containers with a rotation around them. Now, the thing that really helps us here is that we have the rotation happening on this inner div right here. And the reason I say that is because if we were to have it happening on this outer div and we tried to use this animate spin, it's going to reset our rotation to 0, because if we pull up our browse one more time, we look at what's actually happening with our spin, the keyframe is going from transform rotate 0 to transform rotate 360. So if we were to add a spin onto something that's already rotated, it's going to reset this to 0, and then it's going to go ahead and animate to 360. So let's see what that actually would look like if we said animate spin on here. And that's way too fast for us to actually see what's happening. So I'm going to slow this down with an animation duration. I'm just going to add that to the style, or actually I could just add that as a class like I'm going to do in the future. So I'm going to say animation duration. Since Tailwind CSS doesn't have a way to set animation duration, I have to do this custom bracket syntax, and I'm just going to say 10 seconds and allow us to see a little bit better what's going on with each of our stars. So I think Tailwind CSS is actually lying, interestingly enough, about how this is implemented, because they said it was going to go from a rotation of 0 degrees to a rotation of 360, but it looks like they're actually not worried about the initial position. They're just going to rotate everything around to 360. So when these stars align, that's when they get to the 360, and it's going to come from wherever they start. So that's definitely not the animation that we want. Let's change this and actually put our animate spin on the outer absolutely positioned element. So we're going to say animate spin on that, and we'll take the animation duration and go ahead and put it on this, and let's see how this changes. So let me go ahead and save that, and let's see how our stars start to animate there. Now we have another problem, and this problem is that this is already being translated. So when we stick this animate spin on there, it's affecting another transformation, CSS transformation, and it's basically overriding or changing what's going on right here with our translation. So this means we need a dedicated wrapper div that will help us with our animation, and then everything inside can just do what it was already doing. So what I'm going to do with this is, let's see if we can't just go ahead and stick a wrapper div inside here. Say div around all of our other elements, and we'll go ahead and give this a class name. Let's see if there's any. Okay, so size is being set by this, absolute position being set by this. Let's see if we can just give this the class name of our animation and see what happens. So I'm going to say animate spin, and then animation duration. Let's just say 10 seconds. That's fine. And let's see what happens when we do that. Okay, so that is much better. We're not interfering with anything that's going on with our translation. We're also not interfering with this rotation. So essentially we're wrapping what's going on with our rotation of our orbit, and we're wrapping that in an animation, and then we're positioning that with this exterior div. So that's a lot of kind of combination of divs to make this happen, but each of those needs its own layer so that it doesn't interfere with what else is going on. Of course, we're not going to leave these spinning at the same rate. We're actually going to change how they spin, but that's entirely fine. We can go ahead and modify that later. In fact, what I'm going to do is I am going to add a prop for us to dynamically add an animation duration. So let's go ahead and bring that in. We're going to add a prop for spin duration. And let's see, that props with children is also going to have a spin duration key, and we're going to make that a number. So that's going to be a number as well. And then we're just going to add a dynamic style on this. Now we don't have to have this here, so I'm actually going to make this optional. and that's going to allow it to not be there if it's not there, and that's completely fine. So let's say style equals, and we're going to say animation duration, and that's going to be equal to the whatever that spin duration is plus seconds. Or in fact, we could also just have them define it in seconds. So I'm going to actually let this be defined as a string, and that will just allow us to just go ahead and say spin duration there. And once we do that, that should go ahead and give us the ability to go ahead and customize this value. It might be smart for us to go ahead and tell it whether we want that particular orbit to be spinning or not. So I'm going to also give this another prop, and it's going to say spin, or let's say should orbit maybe. And this can be true or false. So this is going to be a Boolean. So let's say should orbit and Boolean. And that will give it that. And we can make this optional as well. So it'll be false by default. And then if we say should orbit equals true, then that will turn on the animation for that particular orbit, which will make that a little bit easier. So I'm going to use my Tailwind merge to go ahead and make that happen. So TW merge here. And we're actually just going to merge whether we should orbit. So I'm going to say not, or if it equals true, equals true, then we go ahead and do our animation spin, and our animation duration, of course, will be set by this spin duration. Or in fact, let's go ahead and make that more specific by orbit duration. Change that and just copy and paste that there. We can also go ahead and set the default value of this to false. It'll be undefined by default, but let's go ahead and just set the default value of that to false so we just specifically understand what's going on. Okay, so since we don't have that should orbit prop being added to any of our stars right now or any of our orbits right now, we're not going to see that orbiting happening. And of course, that's perfectly okay. That'll allow us to animate them one at a time and see what's going on, which particular orbit is being affected. That just takes a lot of the noise away from our animations as we're going ahead and building out those different animation durations. So we'll leave that there. The other thing we want to do is be able to independently rotate our stars or animate the rotation of our stars themselves so that they can rotate in place. And of course, they're also going to go around this bigger orbit as well. So let's see how we need to do that. We understand that just like our spin, we need a separate div to be able to control this star rotation. So let's see, we probably want to add that around our star itself because we have a rotation being set here. We have a negative rotation being set here. All of those are going to come into play. So we will need to add another div in between those. That's just going to be a specific layer to control this animation. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in there. And just to see if this works, let's go ahead and add a class name here. So we're going to add a class name of animate spin again. And we're going to say animation duration is also going to be 10 seconds, just so it's not spinning like crazy. Okay, and that's a nice effect. This makes our stars spin in place. Our sparkles, our circles are doing this too, but we can't see that happening because they're perfectly round. So all of these are spinning in place, and of course they can also spin around an orbit. So let's see how we want to go ahead and change this as well. Let's set this to should spin. Will also allow us to control that, and we'll set the spin duration as well. So spin duration, and that is going to be a string just to be able to directly add a seconds value. And let's go ahead and add that to our props. So we have should orbit, orbit duration. Let's say should spin equals false, and then spin duration. And that will allow us to use those different props. Okay, so how can we integrate those props? Well, we can use the same TW merge to say that if we have should spin equals true, then we can go ahead and add on our animate spin class, and then we're going to pull this animation duration out to a style. So we're not going to worry about that. So we're going to say style equals animation duration, and we'll just go ahead and give it that spin duration. Now, we don't want this. We either need a default value here, or we need to make this not optional. So we have orbit duration. Orbit duration is currently optional. I guess that will leave it at the default for the animation itself, which is going to be super fast. I don't know that I love that, but that's fine. We can leave that as is. Same thing is going to be true here. We're going to have this spin, which is going to be happening over 1 second. So if someone doesn't set a spin duration, it's just going to be undefined. And of course, it's just going to default to the regular animation or animate spin duration, which is just going to be 1 second. So that's going to be kind of fast. But I think our hero orbit component is ready to go. So let me go ahead and save this. And then we're going to go ahead back to our hero and start using some of these props. And just so I remember their names, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste these into a comment so that I remember how we're going to be doing this. So I'm going to create a comment here in TSX, and that'll allow us to just go ahead and reference those when we're going and doing some of our different orbits. So since these are absolutely positioned, I'm actually going to sort these not by type as they currently are, but I'm going to actually sort these by size. So I'm going to bring the 431 up into the top, and let's just go ahead and see if we can kind of sort these so that we can add our smaller orbits will go a little bit faster and our larger orbits will go a little bit slower. That will lead us to a really good effect here. So 590 comes to 4800. So I'm going to move it up. The 440 is going to come right before 430. So I'm going to move it up there. The 530 is going to be put right before our 550. Our 710 is going to be put right before our 800, and our 720 after our 710. And then our 520 is going to be coming right before our 530, and our 650 is going to come before our 710. Okay, so now they're in order of size, which will just allow us to easily be able to tell which one we're going ahead and animating next. So with that, let's go ahead and get our should orbits on all of these, and then we're going to add our orbit durations on all of these as well. So for our first one, let's go ahead and add our should orbit prop, and then we'll also add our orbit duration. Let's just start with 30 seconds and see how that looks. So I'm going to say 30 seconds, and let's see how that orbit duration looks. And I'm definitely not upset with that at all. I think that looks pretty good. So we're going to go from 30 seconds, and we're just going to add 2 seconds for each of our orbits. So my next one is going to be should orbit, and then orbit duration is going to be equal to 32 seconds. For the next one, I'm going to say should orbit, and orbit duration is going to be equal to 34 seconds. Next one, should orbit, and orbit duration is going to be equal to 36 seconds. For the next should orbit, orbit duration is 38 seconds. Add the should orbit prop, and orbit duration is going to be equal to 40 seconds. And let's see, should orbit and orbit duration is going to be equal to 42 seconds. Should orbit duration is going to be equal to 44 seconds. Orbit duration on the next one is going to be equal to 46 seconds. And then for the last one, should orbit and orbit duration is going to be equal to 48 seconds. So with all of those props, let's go ahead and refresh our page and see how those look when all of it is done. And that is a really nice effect. You do have a little bit of difference in the speed that some of these are animating. So it does create a little bit of a variable effect there, but I really like where this is going. If we want to make this a little bit more variable, you can always change these orbit durations so that they might speed up or be a lot faster or a lot slower, but feel free to play around and experiment with that orbit duration so you can control the duration of that particular animation. I also really like that when they go to the bottom here where they have this masked image here where it starts to fade out, you actually have the stars themselves fading out as well. That's a really nice effect. Really like where this ended up. The other thing we need to do with our orbits is we need to go ahead and spin our individual sparkles, stars, and circles. So let's see how we would do that. And let's actually start with the one that's most obvious. That's gonna be this biggest one. Actually, the one that we rotated last is gonna be the one that we might go ahead and spin first. So let's see, we have a spin, or should spin, and let's see what the default is. I'm gonna just save that, and I'm gonna look at what happens. And then yes, that's super fast. We obviously don't want that being the effect. So let's see if we can add a better spin duration on that. So I'm going to say spin duration, and we're just going to say, let's try 10 seconds and see how that looks. So I'm going to pull this out a little bit so we can get a better view of that bigger star as it comes around. And that is actually a really nice effect. I really like that. Let's just see if we can maybe speed that up just a bit. We're going to go to 6 seconds. And I think I like that even better because that's just a more pronounced effect. So I'm going to leave that at 6 seconds. And in fact, I think for all of my stars, I'm going to go ahead and make those go ahead and rotate over 6 seconds. So let's go ahead. We don't need to rotate these at all. It doesn't matter if those spin, so I'm not worried about those. And I have my sparkles. Let's find my other stars. Here's another star. I'm going to say should spin, and spin duration is going to be equal to 6 seconds. And then for my next star, should spin, and spin duration equal to 6 seconds. So that's giving those a nice spin effect. And then I think I'm going to just change the sparkles by a little bit, either slow them down or speed them up so that they just have a little bit of a different feel to them. So let's take one of the sparkles and see what happens when we also spin it. So I'm going to say should spin on this sparkle here. And I'm just going to give the spin duration as, let's just do it in half. Let's say 3 seconds and see what that looks like. Okay, so that's this one right here. I actually like that as well. So for each of my sparkles, I'm going to add this 3 seconds. So I'm just going to copy this, find all of my sparkles, and go ahead and paste those in the props. So my sparkles are going to spin over 3 seconds. Let me save those. Let me come down and see we probably missed one sparkle down here. So that's this one right here. Let me go ahead and save that one and see how that all ends up. Okay, let me refresh my page because that's going to reset all of my animations. So if I refresh my page, okay, I can kind of see this effect happening. And this is a really cool effect. This is one that will definitely catch eyes and make someone take a second glance at this page. You've got this little ping animation happening here. You've got the stars that are orbiting all around this hero section. I really like how this turned out, but feel free to play with this, to experiment with this, and to make this how you would like it to feel. With our animations done in our hero section, which by the way, were completely just CSS animations, which means we didn't have to use any use client or anything like that. We'll go ahead and remove our comment because we won't need that there, but everything else is really nice and tightened up and dialed in this hero section, which means it's time to animate our next section. For our next animation, it's not so much about a CSS animation as it's going to be about just creating a way for these sticky cards to stick to the top and overlap each other as someone scrolls down the screen. It's a great effect and we want to be able to add it to this section. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our sections and we're going to find the projects section, and then I'm going to put away my sidebar so that I can actually see my code. One of the things that's really going to make this particular animation pop is that we're going to not only overlay the cards on each other, but we're going to make sure that they're offset by a little bit so that the second one stacks on the first one and the third one stacks on the second one, and they create this nice stack effect before you continue scrolling down the screen. So we're going to go over how we do that, but first we're going to concentrate on how do we make our cards stick to the top. So in order to do that, let's come to our card, which we see here. We're mapping through our portfolio projects, and each one has a particular card. So in order to add that sticky effect, we'll go ahead and add the sticky class to go ahead and leave those as position sticky. And then let me go ahead and save this, and we'll see how this works as we scroll up. Let me go ahead and refresh my page as well to make sure that it's taking effect. For any sticky elements to actually stick to the top of the page, we need to tell them where they need to become sticky at. So we can say top 0 here, and that will allow it to stick when it gets to top 0. So you can see that that's working well now. And as we continue to scroll, of course, that's kind of a little bit of our layering effect, but we want to offset each one of these, and we don't want to stick it to top 0. I think we want it to be somewhere around here where it is able to stick near the top, but not completely at the top. So let's go ahead and see how we'll do that. We can say something like top 16, for example, and we'll see where that sticks at. And that's about right. So this top 16 is actually sticking at 64 pixels, but of course we want the next one to come in somewhere around here where it's giving it 20 or so pixels of additional room for each individual card. So we want the first one to be at top 16. We'll say the next one's at top 20 or 24, and so on and so forth. So in order to do that, what we'll do is we'll add a dynamic top value. So instead of adding a CSS class, we're going to go ahead and come in here and say style equals, and then we can add a dynamic top value by saying top, and then giving this a calculated value of 64 pixels plus our individual portfolio project index. So when you map over a JavaScript array, you are able to get as the second argument an index. So I'm going to pull out that index, project index, and when it starts, it's going to be 0. When you get to the next one, it's going to be 1. When you get to the next one, it's going to be 2. So knowing that, we can pull in that project index into here and say, okay, calculate my base 64 pixels and then add some pixels based on which index this is. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to say project index, excuse me, I need my interpolated value so we can actually use our variables in here. Project index times, let's just say 20 pixels. Let's see if there's anything wrong with our style. Not seeing anything. Oh, the problem is our card component is not taking a style prop. So we need to be able to allow the card component to take a style prop. Let's go into our card component and fix that real quick. In order to do that, we can use props with children, but props with children doesn't give us every available attribute that we could normally use with HTML. In order to do that, we need to use a different type from React, and this is going to be component props without ref, and that's going to be, let's go ahead and erase this, and we need to tell it what our base element is. So we're going to say for a div. So when you say component props without ref for a div, that automatically uses class name, automatically uses children, but then gives us every other attribute that a div would normally have. So we can say, okay, for any other attributes, we also want to add those into our base div. So I'm just going to basically spread those here and say anything like style, any other attributes we want to add, let's just go ahead and put it on the base div here, which will allow us to use our style prop. So coming back to our projects, we have our style set here. Now it's not erroring out. And let's see what happens now that we scroll down. Okay, so this stack effect is happening, but it's not a big enough effect. Let's try multiplying this by 40 and see what happens there. So let's go ahead and pull this back down and see. And okay, that's a great stacking effect. And of course, the third one's going to come in and it's going to override all the other ones and continue to scroll up the page. So we have our first one, it's going to come up, it's going to stop. Our second one's going to come up below it. It's going to stop a little bit lower down on the screen. And then our third one would stop if there was another fourth one to come up, but of course it won't. It's going to continue to scroll. So that is an amazing effect just added with CSS Sticky and a little bit of a dynamic styles here. And that created our sticky project section with these cards that stack on top of each other. That's the only effect that we're going to add to this particular section. So let's go ahead and move on to our tape. As we scroll down to our tape, we can continue to use CSS animations to create all of our effects. The great thing about not using JavaScript animations when they're not required is that you get a lot better performance from your page, not only from a rendering perspective, but also from the amount of code that you have to be able to send to a user in order to create some of these different effects. So this is also going to be a CSS animation, or we're going to do this with a CSS animation. We're going to animate our text inside of this tape from right to left. So in order to do that, let's open up our tape section and let's put our sidebar away for a second. I'm also going to toggle word wrap so we can see all of these different classes. And then we're going to talk about how we need to do this. Now here are our words and they're inside this flexed container. And then within that, we have the mask image that's actually masking them. So we don't want to mess with anything above the mask. We only want things that are below the mask so that we can animate these underneath of our mask and make it look like our words are flowing off the screen. So if we do this, what we need to do is we need to negatively translate this particular flexed container over to the left. So I'm going to actually add an inline style to be able to show y'all what happens when we get to a specific point. So I'm going to say transform, and then it's going to be translate X negative, let's just say 100 pixels. And let's see what happens when we save that. Okay, so that's negative 100 pixels. Let's go up to, let's say 300 pixels. See what's happening there. Let's go to 500 pixels. We're continuing to move to the left, but eventually we get to where there's no more words. So let's go to negative 750 pixels. And we're eventually going to see where we just don't have any words following all of the words that we've shown here on the screen. So in order to basically have this look infinite, we want to be able to show all of our words. So we want all of our words to be able to flow across the screen, but we also want it to look like it's an infinite effect. So for that to happen, what we need to do is we need to basically duplicate our words. Now we could come up here to our array and just duplicate our words. That's one way. We could also come in here and do a copy and paste of this entire thing. That's another way. But if we have to change any of those things, so if we have to change the words or we have to change any of this code, then it becomes a case of repeating ourselves, which we would like to avoid if we can help it. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the style first of all, because we know what's happening there, that we know what div we want to translate. And inside of that, we're going to say, basically, let's duplicate these words by creating a new array with two values, filling it with a dummy value of 0, and then mapping over it. So essentially we're creating duplicates, right? We have an empty array with two values, we're mapping over that. And for each one of those, it doesn't matter what's in it. We just want to get the index. And then we're going to display some JSX for each of those. So essentially we're going to bring the words into here, and we're going to wrap these in a React fragment just so that React is happy with what's going on. So I'm going to say fragment here and key equals index, and let's save that. So this duplicates our words. You saw before when we went to -750, we were showing the end of our words on the screen. Well, let's try that one more time by adding a style here. And let's say transform translate x -750 pixels. And let's look at what happens. And see, we have the end of our words, which our last word is reliable, but then you have another set of words coming behind it, which is exactly what we were trying to do. So that helps us because now if we translate to the negative value, let's say 1/2, we've essentially gone through our entire set of words. So 1/2 is going to be our first set of words, and of course our second set of words is going to come behind that. So let's actually look at what happens when we reset that translation value to 0 just by refreshing our page. And then we're going to say negative translate x 1/2, and it should look exactly the same as it would when it was negative translate x 0. So let me go ahead back to 0, and let's make sure when we save it, it looks exactly the same. And there is a little bit of difference, and that's basically because there's a little bit of space in between this entire flexed items. There's a little bit of gap in between each of these, but we don't have that same amount of space on the end of our flexed container. So we need to say PR4 to add that 16 pixels of space that should allow everything to line up. So let's say negative translate x 0, translate x 1/2. If we save this and nothing happens, which it didn't, that means we're exactly in a spot where we can start to do this animation. Now, Tailwind does not have the keyframes or the animation in place to make this happen, which means we're going to need to create a custom animation within our Tailwind config. So let's come into our sidebar, let's find our Tailwind config, and let's talk about how we can create a custom animation to make this go from translate 0 to negative translate 1/2. So we need to add another keyframe in here. Let's just call this move left. How about just move left? Move left sounds good to me. For our move left keyframes, we're going to start at 0%, which has to be in a string because of the way that we're defining this in JavaScript. And we're going to say transform translate x 0. And then when we get to 100%, we're going to be at transform translate x -50%. And we need to add a comment in there. And that should allow us to have a move left keyframe. Now, a keyframe needs to be used inside of an animation if we want them to be infinitely looped with our animation iteration count. So to do that, I'm going to add a move left animation, and that animation is going to use our move left keyframe. It's going to do it over 1 second because we can change the duration later. It doesn't really matter. And we're going to say linear for our easing and infinite for our repeat. Infinite. There we go. And that should set up our animation. So let's try and go back to our tape.tsx and use that animation right here. So instead of my negative translate x 1/2, I'm going to try and say animate, and I'm going to say animate move left, save that. And it should be racing right now, of course, because our animation duration is not set to anything reasonable. Let's try an animation duration of 30 seconds to start out with and see if that looks like it's a lot more reasonable. And that is much more reasonable on our animation duration. Let's see if we see any hiccups or anything that would lead us to believe that this is not working well. It looks like it's silky smooth right now. I like this 30-second value, and everything looks like it's happening exactly as I want it to. So what we did was we created a custom animation, and then we just changed the animation duration dynamically with our animation duration rule. Let's see how it looks on the tablet view. We have the same thing going on here. We're seeing it appear on the right side of the screen, disappear on the left. That's exactly what we want to happen with our tape. And even on the mobile, as we scroll up, we can see that that tape still looks great there. So I really like how this tape effect is turning out. So with that, I think this is complete. Let's move on to the next section of the page. Now that our tape animation is all done, let's go to our testimonials, where we're going to be animating our testimonials in a very similar way. But we're going to be adding some additional effects because when we hover it, we want the animation to stop and the hover to rotate the card that we're hovering. So this is an additional kind of flourish here that we want to add to our testimonials. So let's come into our testimonials.tsx and let's figure out how we can create this particular effect. I'm going to close my sidebar to give my code a little more room, and I'm also going to open up and toggle my word wrap so we can see all the classes that are being added. So we have our flexed container that's flexing all of our cards, and then we have our mask image container that's essentially making sure that the images or the testimonial cards flow off the screen or look like they're disappearing when they get to the left side of the screen, and of course appearing on the right side of the screen. So we want to be underneath this is where we want to have those animations happen. First, let's go ahead and attack the rotation of the cards. Let's go ahead and see what happens when we add a hover animation here and we say negative rotate 3, and let's see what happens with our card when we hover those cards. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. Now it does do the hover, but there's a couple of things. Number one, we can make it smoother with a transition, but number two, we're seeing a little bit of cutoff on the top and bottom. We need to account for that as well. So let's go ahead and make it smoother with a transition class, and we'll say duration 300 to make it happen over 300 milliseconds instead of the default 150, and that will just make a nice smooth animation there. By the way, if we didn't have that duration set, here's what would happen. It'd just be a little bit faster, and I just don't feel like it's as smooth. So that's why I always kind of try and dial in that duration based on the animation that I'm working with so that we have a nice smooth effect. So yeah, it's just buttery smooth at that 300 milliseconds, but it doesn't take too long. Now that we have that done, we need to figure out how we can get the overflow not to be clipped off the way that we're seeing. We have overflow X clip up here, and of course that would normally work, but I think this mask image is actually the culprit for making our cards cut off on the top and bottom. So in order to account for this, what we can do is we can add a little bit of padding in the Y direction by saying PY4, and that will hopefully push our cards to where we can see our full animation or our rotation, which it does, but that's not super helpful because it also adds extra spacing on the top and the bottom of this div. So to account for that, we can say negative MY4 to add negative margin to the top and bottom, which helps a little bit, but we already set some margin here, so it's not going to be overridden by this right here. So to account for that as well, I'm going to bring these down by 16 pixels each, and that should account for the extra spacing that we would have added with this padding top and bottom. So that should make our rotation be able to happen and be able to see the entire thing. Now we're going to take a very similar strategy to these testimonials as we took in our tape, and that is we're going to duplicate our testimonials so that when we translate these from right to left, we can get through the entire line of them and then restart back at the beginning. So I'm going to duplicate them by creating a new array with only 2 values. I'm going to fill that with just a dummy value, and then I'm just going to map over those 2 values and go ahead and get the index of that particular item. And I'm only getting the index to make React happy because React needs keys for these kinds of things. So I'm going to fill this in. And then for each of those mapped items, I'm going to say fragment key equals index. And then I'm going to wrap my fragment right here. So now instead of one set of testimonial cards, now we have 2 sets because we just mapped over an array with a length of 2. The index will be 0 and 1. And then for each one of those mapped items, we create a set of testimonials. So we have 2 sets instead of just 1. That's gonna be really helpful for us when we want to translate left like we did with our tape. So let's go ahead and add that translation. I'm gonna say animate move left, and we know that's gonna happen way too quick if we don't set an animation duration. So I'm gonna set an animation duration of 30 seconds to start. And let's just see how this looks. I'm gonna go ahead and save this, and we're going to hopefully see this start to animate. So that's animating, but it's definitely too fast. I don't like that animation duration. So let me increase this to double. Let's take this to 60 seconds because we really want people to be able to read these, especially in the mobile view where it's going to be a lot harder. So I like the 60 seconds. In fact, if we even increase this to 90 seconds, it might make it just a little bit better because we're still getting that full animation of these cards, but now it's just a very slight effect where we're able to see the next testimonial come in from the right side. So let's go ahead and increase our screen size, our browser size, and just take a look at our entire responsive views and make sure that this looks good across every screen size. So I really like how this looks here. If we hover over one, we're seeing a little bit of rotation. The thing that we forgot to do though is make sure that if we hover over it, the animation actually pauses, which will be even more important in the smaller views because we'd like to be able for someone to pause this animation and be able to actually read what these testimonials are saying. So I'm going to pull this over and I'm going to talk about how we can do this. So animation, we're able to actually dynamically pause an animation with CSS as well. And we can do this with animation play state. So if we set animation play state and we say paused and just set that rule, it should go ahead and pause our animation. Well, what if instead of doing it that way, what if when we hovered a card or hovered this row, that's when we changed our animation play state? Well, that's easy enough. We can just add a hover modifier here so that we can say, okay, when this is hovered, go ahead and set the animation play state to pause. And of course, the animation play state by default is unpaused or played. So now when we hover, not only do we get that great card rotation of these, but now when we're hovered over this, we get it paused so we can actually read what these testimonials are saying. And then when we unhover, then we get a play state again. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and pull our browser out again and let's see what's going on with our different screen sizes to make sure that everything looks good here as well. So yes, we do see that when we hover, we can stop these testimonial animations. And of course, when we're not hovered, they are playing and they just look great. And then even on the mobile view, we're getting a great animation here where we're able to see these appear on the right and disappear on the left. So this is really dialed in right now. I really like the way that this looks, and this finishes up the animations for this section. Let's go ahead and move on to our next section. One of the things I noticed as we were looking at this mobile view is I saw a little bit of a jump in between when our animation ends and when our next animation begins. And if we know anything about that, we'll know that that's because we have this gap 8 here, but no account for the ending padding to the right. So I'm going to say PR8, and that should keep our animation from jumping between when our new animation starts and when our old animation ends. That'll be the last part of the animation for this section. This is beautifully animated. It looks great in all screen sizes. I really like how this turned out. With that, let's go ahead and move on to the animation for the next section. Now that we've taken care of our testimonials animation, let's go ahead and move into our about section where we're going to do 3 different effects in this section. The first effect is going to be the My Toolbox, where we're going to move these top toolbox items to the left. We're going to move the bottom ones to the right, and we're going to make sure that they look like they're infinitely scrolling one on top of the other. And to add an additional layer to that, we're also going to ensure that one of them is going to move faster than the other, so it just adds a nice little effect there. Down here with our emoji over the map, what we're going to do is we're going to ping that. We're going to make that look like the background is pinging over that map. And then beyond the code, we're going to use Framer Motion to add a nice drag effect. That's the only one so far that we won't be able to do with CSS Animations. So we're going to talk through how to implement that with Framer Motion. So opening up the about.tsx, let's take a look at what we have here. I'm seeing a couple of unused imports, so I'm going to go ahead and remove those real quick, just the ones that are a little bit lighter in color. Save that. And then coming down into our actual section, let's start with My Toolbox and talk about what we need to do here. These are encapsulated, and as I close my sidebar, these are encapsulated inside of our toolbox items right now. So let's go ahead and prep our toolbox items component to make this animation, and then we'll come back and actually create the animation itself. You can see that we have our items.map, and based on the other sections on this page, anytime we want to create any kind of animation where we need to show all of our items and make it look like it's an infinite scroll, we want to at least double the number of items that we have. So in order to do that, we're going to do the same thing we've done before. We're going to create a new array. So new array with 2 items. We're going to fill that with a dummy item, and then we're just going to map over that new array, and we're not going to care about what each element is. We just care about the index in order to go ahead and pass that to React to keep React happy. And we're going to create a fragment with a key of index. And inside that fragment is where we're going to move our items. So we're going to have our items.map. Those are going to go inside of our fragment. And this essentially doubles the number of items because we're essentially just going ahead for each array item. We're outputting one set of items. So if you have 2 array items, you have 2 sets of our items.map. So this is happening twice. Now that that's done, we can see over here that my toolbox looks like we have our extra items here. Now we need to see how do we go ahead and animate these. And it's going to be by animating this flexed class right here. Thankfully, we already have a way within this component using our items wrapper class name. We can just drop an animation class in there, and that should go ahead and allow us to animate these items using this component as is. So let me go ahead and close out this toolbox items, and then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add the class names that are going to make this happen. We already have an animate move left class, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to say that we're going to use the items wrapper class name is going to be animate move left. And of course, it's going to happen over 1 second, so it's going to be way too fast. So let's go ahead and set an animation duration as well. Animation duration, and we'll just go ahead and set that to, let's just say 30 seconds to go ahead and slow that down. For the one below it, we're not going to use animate move left. We actually want to use the reverse of it. We actually want it to move to the right. So in this case, we don't have a move right animation yet. Let's go ahead and open up our Tailwind config and create keyframes in an animation for moving items to the right. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my sidebar, come down to my Tailwind config, and our move left is essentially going to be, it's going to be opposite this. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, and I'm going to call this move right. And it's going to go from -50% to 0. And that's how we're going to move it to the right. So I'm going to save that. I'm also going to come up here to my animation and ensure that not only do we have the keyframes we need that uses the move right keyframe, but we also have the correct animation class that we can go ahead and use to do that linearly and infinitely. That's going to create our animation within our CSS. So after we save that config, it should be applied to our project. Let's come back into our about, and let's say instead of negative translate x1/2, let's just say animate move right, and that moves it to the right. And of course, we need to slow this down. We're going to say animation duration of 20 seconds. And that should make that move at a little bit different rate. In fact, let's go ahead and bring this down even a little bit more. Let's go ahead and make this 15 seconds to just get that moving a little bit faster. So that's a nice little effect there. I like that because we're taking the same toolbox items and we're displaying them with some different animations. That just looks really nice and definitely catches the eye and brings the eye to that section. So I really like how that turned out. Now that we have that part done, let's go ahead and move down to our card that contains our map. So that looks like it's going to be this one right here. Let me go ahead and toggle our word wrap so we can see all of the classes that are being applied to this item. What I'm noticing here is that since the background is actually applied to the item itself, we're going to need to break this out because essentially we want our background to sit on top of another element that we can animate. So we're going to have our emoji on top. We're going to have our background that we currently see, this gradient in the middle, and then we're going to have our background that we're going to animate all the way in the bottom. So let's go ahead and create a couple more divs here. So I'm going to say div class name equals absolute. Inset 0 will make it the same size as whatever absolute position element we have as the parent. We're also going to say rounded full to give it the same border radius. And we're just going to move our background gradient from the actual element itself to this absolute position element inside. It does sit on top of our smile right now. We can move that down just by saying -Z10. That should move it below our smile. We want to duplicate this div because we want a div in the very bottom, and we want this one to be the one that animates. So let's go ahead and move this down. Actually, I'm going to say -Z20 to ensure that it comes below everything else. And then this is the one that we're going to want to animate. So we're going to add the animate ping class. This is actually default from Tailwind, has this animate ping class, but we're going to slow this down a little bit with our animation duration. So I'm going to say animation duration of 2 seconds, and that will slow it down to half speed, and it just gives it that nice feel of it pinging, but it not being super rushed with that animation. It just has a nice effect there. That was pretty much all there was to that card animation. Now let's see how we animate our beyond the code section. So let's find that card. That card has these hobbies. So for each one of these hobbies, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to drag these. We can't do this with a CSS animation. CSS is not going to save the state that says where our items are being dragged to. It's certainly not going to give us the ability to set drag boundaries like we want to do. So for this, we're going to have to import Framer Motion to make this work. So I'm going to come to the very top of my file, and I'm going to import Motion from Framer Motion, and that will allow us to use that motion.div that we need to put inside of our hobbies.map. So our wrapper div is going to, instead of a div, is going to become a motion.div, and we're going to end that down here with ending motion.div, and that will allow us to add the drag attribute. Now you can see that we're getting an error over here, and that's basically because anytime you bring in Framer Motion, you have to tell Next.js that this is a client component. So I need to come to the very top of my file and add the use client directive. That should get us out of that error and get us back to seeing our coded page. Now that we have this, let's go ahead and add the drag attribute. So I'm going to just say drag, and as simply as that, that allows us to actually start dragging these around the page. I don't like though that these can go over our title, so someone could do this and just put everything over our title. Not loving that. So let's go ahead and give some boundaries to where the user can actually drag these items. In order to do that, I'd like to make the constraints my relative container. So we're going to try and do that. And according to the Framer Motion docs, that means we need to give this a ref and then tell this that the drag constraints is equal to the ref that we give this div right here. So in order to give it a ref, we need to create a ref, and that happens at the top of our component. So I'm going to say const constraint ref is equal to use ref from React, and we'll give that a default value of null. And then we'll go ahead and apply this ref down here to our parent div. So I'm going to say ref equals, and that's going to be equal to our constraint ref right there. Now we can add drag constraints. So I'm going to say drag constraints, and that's going to be equal to our constraint ref. And as soon as we have that added, let's save that. Doesn't look like it changes anything right offhand, but let's go ahead and try and drag some stuff around and see what our constraints does. So anytime we try and drag something out of that constraint container, it just pops it right back in and doesn't allow that to happen, which is a great effect. They can still move things around, but it's kind of within the boundaries that are still going to make our page look great and work really well. This section, even though it was pretty short from the animation perspective, is really eye-catching and is a very impressive section. So I hope you're able to follow that, even though we didn't have to do too much because we've already done a lot of the groundwork. And of course, bringing in Framer Motion allows us to do this with very few lines of code as well. So all of that led to some very eye-catching effects without a lot of code, which I always love. Let's go ahead and pull the browser out and take a look at all of our responsive views for our entire page and make sure everything looks good. So up here in the title, we have our orbit, we have our animated dot. Moving down to our featured projects, we have this stacking card effect that we see happening on the desktop. We have our tape that flows from right to left with all of our words. We have our testimonials that pauses and has this like nice little rotation effect and comes from left to right. And then of course down here we have our three effects, both our drag effect, we have our ping effect, and we have this My Toolbox effect that we can see with a nice little animation. Moving over to our tablet, we can see the same things happen over here. It looks beautiful on tablet as well. You have some of the same things are able to happen over here. And then on the mobile view, you can see that everything looks great here as well. So let me go ahead and refresh my page to make sure that my testimonials are moving properly. It looks like they are. Of course, my tape is moving great. We have our stacking cards that are working well. And up here in the hero section, even though you can't see quite the same sparkles and stars, there are every once in a while you're going to see a star move past that gives that hint that there's something going on in some of the bigger views. So all in all, this looks really nice. I'm really happy with the way that this turned out, and I hope that you're able to customize this and use this to not only show off your skills, but hopefully be able to use this as a portfolio for yourself. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm excited to do the next one with you as well. I'll see you in the next video.